Across centuries, ships have sailed from port and vanished into silence. Some were lost to storms, others to ice, collision, or human error. Their names fill old ledgers and logbooks, each line ending without an answer. These are the stories of vessels that left harbour and were never seen again. Real expeditions, real people, and real mysteries swallowed by the sea. The Vivaldi brothers' Atlantic attempt, 1291. Soft wind moves over the harbour, carrying the scent of salt and wood. The year is 1291. Genoa's docks are alive with shouts, ropes tightening, and sails rising against the dawn. Two ships, slender and sharp-keeled, drift away from the quay, their oars dipping in rhythm. They are not traders or warships, but vessels on a mission whispered about in markets and monasteries alike, to reach the Indies by sailing west, across the ocean sea. The brothers Vandino and Ugolino Vivaldi stand at the rail, watching the familiar shoreline fade. They are merchants, navigators, and dreamers of a world larger than the one drawn on parchment. Their plan is astonishing for the time. No European ship has ever passed far beyond the western edge of Africa and returned. Yet they believe that by following the sun, they can find a direct sea route to the lands of spices and silk. The two galleys, named Alegranza and Sant' Antonio, carry roughly 150 men each. Provisions for 10 years fill the holds: wine, grain, salted fish, and water stored in barrels. Two Franciscan friars sail with them, bound by faith to spread their message in unknown lands. The ships slip past the Spanish coast, making brief stops in Majorca, Valencia, and Cadiz, before turning toward the open Atlantic. Behind them lies the safety of known waters. Ahead, the first uncharted horizon of medieval Europe. The route is traced later on maps by careful hands. From the Strait of Gibraltar, the galleys hug the African coastline, moving south along the shore of Morocco. The sea here is restless, swept by winds that blow constantly from the north. The men row and sail in turns, resting only when the weather allows. Days stretch into weeks, the sun burning their skin, salt drying on every surface. They pass beyond the familiar ports and into regions drawn as empty space on most charts. Their last known stop is a place called Gazora, often identified as Cape Nun, a lonely point of land south of Morocco. Beyond it, no letter, no journal, no survivor's tale continues the story. In the map rooms of Genoa, the trail stops abruptly at that cape. Chroniclers writing 3 years later record only that the two galleys sailed past Gazora and were never heard from again. The pages that should have followed at the discovery of a route or the record of a wreck were never written. What remains is a gap, a silence that stretches across oceans. Centuries later, scattered voices try to fill that silence. A friar writing in the 14th century claims that one of the ships reached Ethiopia, where its crew settled among Christian allies and chose not to return. Another text, known as the Book of Knowledge, tells of Genoese sailors captured in a distant city ruled by a king of immense power. In the 15th century, a Venetian merchant reports meeting a man on the African coast who spoke in the Genoese dialect and claimed descent from one of the Vivaldi survivors. Each of these fragments is small, uncertain, and impossible to verify. Together they form a pattern, faint but persistent, of rumour carried by trade winds and retold by sailors in every port. Modern historians return to the same question: how far could they have gone? The galleys of the 13th century were long, narrow, and shallow-drafted, designed for the calm waters of the Mediterranean. They depended on oars as much as sails, their hulls not meant to ride the heavy Atlantic swell. Their speed and range were impressive in coastal seas, but once out of sight of land, they would have been at the mercy of wind and current. It is likely they followed the African coastline, searching for safe anchorages, moving slowly southward. The farther they went, the harder it became to find fresh water, food, and timber for repairs. Some theories suggest they may have reached the Canary Islands, which were known only through rumour at the time. One of the ship names, Alegranza, matches the name of an island in the archipelago, perhaps a later echo of their landfall. Others believe they may have reached the coast of Senegal or Gambia, where stories of pale-skinned strangers circulated centuries later. A few more daring voices imagine they sailed far beyond, swept by the Canary Current toward the equatorial Atlantic. If so, the narrow galleys built for rowing near shore would have been overwhelmed by waves higher than their masts. In the years following their disappearance, Genoa searched for answers. Ugolino's son, Sorlione, is said to have organised his own expedition eastward by land, hoping to find news of his father and uncle. He reportedly reached Mogadishu but was forbidden to travel farther inland. His account stops there, another line cut short. The archive of Genoa preserves his name but nothing more. The absence of proof invites imagination. Some chroniclers saw the Vivaldi voyage as a failure of human pride, a warning against trespassing beyond divine limits. Others, centuries later, viewed it as a first step toward the great discoveries that would follow. Columbus himself, born in Genoa 2 centuries after the brothers vanished, may have heard stories of their attempt. The idea that the ocean could be crossed did not appear out of nowhere. It had already been tried and lost. Back in the map room, the traces of their path form a slender line of ink across the parchment, ending abruptly at the edge of the known world. Cartographers later filled that void with sea monsters, serpents, and the faces of winds. But behind the drawings lay a simple truth. 2 ships set sail and did not return. Their fate, buried under centuries of retelling, remains an empty space no record has ever filled. If one studies the old charts under lamplight, the ink fades near the western edge. Cape Nun sits alone on the margin. South of it, the lines break off, replaced by open parchment. Somewhere beyond that point, the Vivaldi brothers disappeared into weather, distance, and time. There is no wreck to examine, no bones to study, no anchor raised from the deep. Only the faint echo of their departure, the idea that men once stood on those decks believing the world was wide enough for faith to carry them across. The harbour they left behind still exists. The sea still meets the same stones, and somewhere, between the coast of Morocco and the farthest winds of the Atlantic, the trace of 2 galleys fades into the horizon, a journey drawn in ink and then erased by the sea. John Cabot's second voyage, 1498. They set out from Bristol in May 1498, 5 ships cutting the Atlantic swell with fresh sails and confident hearts. John Cabot, already celebrated for his first voyage, commanded this new fleet. His aim was bold, to press farther along the shores he believed he had glimpsed in 1497, perhaps even find a route south to Asia. The wind was fair, the provisions loaded, and the crew, some 200 souls, trusted they would triumph where others feared to sail. In the early days, everything looked promising. The fleet steered past Ireland, edging into the deep Atlantic lanes. But storms, always lurking in those seas, struck swiftly. One of the ships was battered, masts cracked, hull leaking, and limped into port in Ireland seeking shelter and repairs. That vessel became the last confirmed return from the expedition. The rest sailed onward under Cabot's command, their course into uncertainty. From that point, the timeline becomes a silent ledger. Cabot and his 3 or 4 remaining ships vanished. No further logs, no letters, no dispatches ever reached England confirming their fate. Over years, chroniclers would refer to them as lost at sea, but few details would ever emerge. The Great Chronicle of London records the departure and the damaged ship, but not the final end of Cabot's venture. Some later thinkers propose that Cabot may have again landed on the North American coast. Cartographic evidence hints that maps drawn by Juan de la Cosa, a Spanish navigator, included coastal outlines labelled as Land of the English, perhaps drawn from knowledge gathered between 1497 and 1500. That evidence, though inconclusive, suggests explorers of the era believed new shores had been charted. Some historians even suggest that Friar Giovanni Antonio de Carbonarius, who accompanied the expedition, stayed behind in Newfoundland to found a missional settlement. But these remain theories built on whispers, not proof. By 1500, scholars like Alwyn Ruddock argued the missing ships had returned in secret after long exploration, then faded from record. But rival scholars dismiss that, noting there is no verified English record that Cabot ever reappeared. His pension was still paid until 1499, but that may have been administrative inertia or support by his heirs. No authenticated homepage awaited him. The last confirmed moment in time, the damaged ship landing in Ireland, marks a boundary in the timeline. Before that, the narrative flows, outfitting in Bristol, commissioning by King Henry VII, setting sail with ambition and hope, the storm damage and separation. After that, history falls silent. That moment in Ireland stands like a faint battered beacon on a dark map. A crew, exhausted, battered, possibly muttering about retreat. Yet Cabot's fleet never followed. No survivors returned to tell of wreck or mutiny, no journal surfaced. The sea swallowed them, leaving only rumours and late charts. Across decades, cartographers sketched tongues of coastline, from Nova Scotia down to Chesapeake, many crediting the English discovery of 1498. These maps served to justify English claims in later centuries, but they never carried names of ships or men lost. They offered approximations, distortions, guesses. Pilots and navigators continued citing Cabot's voyages as precedent, yet the records remain emptier than many would prefer. The 1498 fleet's disappearance stands as one of the great vanishings of the Age of Discovery, once visible lines on the sea map, now erased by time. In that void, historians sift through scattered documents, letters, payments, cartographic hints, even missionary reports. But all those fragments lead back to one tragic fact. John Cabot sailed again in 1498, and after one ship forced into Ireland, he and the rest vanished from history. The timeline stops, the last sighting fades into the ocean's fog. Gaspar Corte-Real, 1501. A faint light glints on northern seas. Imagine the cold spray, the wind biting, and a captain peering ahead at ice floes. This is the setting for Gaspar Corte-Real's final journey, where charts end and silence begins. Gaspar Corte-Real was no novice to exploration. Born around 1450 in Portuguese nobility, he had followed his father and brother on the Atlantic voyages. On his first voyage in 1500, he reached Greenland's icy coasts, mistaking them for Asia, then returned home. By 1501, he was ready to push again. This time, he commanded 3 caravels, sailing west in search of new lands beyond the ice and cold seas. In May 1501, the fleet made port to regroup, then launched into the Atlantic. Their intended path was more westerly than before, sidestepping Greenland's frozen coast and aiming toward the lands beyond what mariners of the day sometimes called Terra Verde, a vague term for the green lands to the west. As they advanced, they encountered treacherous seas, drifting ice, and unknown winds. The sea was not kind. Much of the route beyond a certain latitude was blank on any map. After ice thwarted further northern progress, the fleet altered course and approached what is believed to be Labrador or Newfoundland, coastlines marked by evergreen trees, large rivers, and sparse native settlements. On this stretch, the explorers encountered indigenous people. According to letters of the time, they captured 57 natives, possibly Beothuk or other local groups, to transport back to Portugal. That act, cruel and opportunistic, was part of funding and prestige of exploration in that era. Here the map emerges briefly again. Coastlines traced, rivers drawn, patches of forest marked in ink. One of the caravels returned early carrying some of these captives. Then a second ship turned for home. Both made it back to Portugal in October 1501, bearing reports, maps, and cargo. But the third, the one in which Gaspar himself sailed, never came home. At that moment the map page ends. No record remains of Gaspar's vessel after the fleet split. No journals survive. No reports of wreck or survivors reach the European ports. He vanished into those icy waters, swallowed by wind and waves. The last inked line is the coast he visited and the rivers he charted, a land unknown yet mapped in fragments. In the archives, correspondence from Pietro Pasqualigo, a Venetian diplomat, described the coast the explorers visited. Great rivers, many people, wooden dwellings, clothing made from furs, skins of animals. He noted that these natives resembled what had been seen in Greenland. In summer their hair turned outward, in winter inward, skins worn without much sewing. Those notes give texture to the land where Gaspar disappeared. His brother Miguel organised a rescue mission in 1502 with 3 ships hoping to retrace his footsteps. The expedition reached Newfoundland and the eastern coast, splitting search routes along rivers and bays. But Miguel's ship failed to appear at the rendezvous point on August the 20th. The other 2 vessels returned, but Miguel too was lost without trace. The missing pages grow thicker. The maps of Newfoundland and Labrador of later European mariners include coastlines named Corte-Real Land, Codfish Land, or Terra Verde, but none carry inscriptions of Gaspar or Miguel's fate. The world saw their discoveries but not their end. Over time, myths gathered around Dighton Rock, a large sandstone boulder on the Taunton River in Massachusetts. In the early 20th century, someone claimed to have found inscriptions, Miguel Corte-Real 1511, Latin phrases and symbols of Portuguese arms. That claim suggested Miguel might have survived, lived inland, even led an indigenous group. But historians have cast serious doubt. The inscriptions are poorly recorded, their origins disputed, and no contemporaneous document supports them. Cartographers and navigators after the 16th century used maps citing Corte-Real to denote northern coastlines. Those maps imply Europeans believed the explorer had travelled that far, but they also reflect hope, conjecture, and the influence of maps passed between sailing nations. The land labelled Corte-Real might be a mingling of what local fishermen saw, hearsay, and copied cartographic elements. In the map room, one sees layers, the coastline of Labrador, jagged bays, rivers flowing inland. Over that, the later nautical charts, speculative lines reaching toward Hudson Bay or beyond. But between 1501 and 1502, the manuscript pages are blank. There is no continuation. The searches that followed report nothing. No campfires found, no skeletal remains, no logs recovered. Gaspar's legacy lives in those coastline names, in the maps drawn by others, in the echoes of what was seen, captured and lost. In Portuguese records he is credited with claiming territory under royal charter. Lands discovered in the North Atlantic for Portugal were to be under his command. But whether any of that territory was permanently held is another matter. The maps grew, the claims multiplied, but none rescued Gaspar himself. As we trace the route on the chart from Lisbon to Greenland, then turning southwest to Labrador, we follow the faint trail of caravels cutting through cold seas. 2 ships return, bearing captives and stories. One continues into darkness. The ink fades where he disappeared. The missing pages are vast. No survivors, no letters, no return. In later centuries, the figure of Corte-Real grew in Portuguese memory, statues erected, claims of first Portuguese in Newfoundland made. But historians warn that much is built on weak foundations, rumours, later propaganda, national pride. The firm ground lies only in the few logs, diplomatic letters, and mapping fragments preserved. On the map table, we hover over the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the rivers, the coast. The ink traces stop at Labrador. Southward, ocean blank. Northward, ice fields. Between those bounds live the missing pages. Gaspar Corte-Real's expedition sailed into those unknowns and disappeared, leaving beyond the last sighting a story drawn in chart, rumour and absence. Miguel Corte-Real, 1502. A grey dawn breaks in Lisbon harbour. Ships lean at the quayside, ropes taut, sails furled ready. The air is crisp. Seagulls circle above. It is the 10th of May, 1502. Miguel Corte-Real steps aboard the lead ship of a small fleet of 3 caravels. His face is set, stern with resolve. He carries not just the hopes of his crew, but the weight of a brother's disappearance. Miguel has invested vast resources into this mission. Gaspar, his younger brother, vanished a year earlier after leading a voyage to Newfoundland and Labrador. Now Miguel sails west in search of him. The king, Manuel of Portugal, endorses the effort and promises Miguel the captaincy over any new lands he discovers on this voyage. The fleet casts off, slipping down the Tagus River into open sea. Their course follows the northern Atlantic route. The ships pass Azores, skirt the edge of Greenland, aiming toward the coasts Gaspar is believed to have visited. After weeks at sea, they reach the shores of Newfoundland, the same land that Gaspar charted in 1501. Here the ocean, land, ice and wind converge in a wild, untamed environment. Upon arrival, the 3 ships split up to widen the search. The agreement reconvene on the 20th of August at a predetermined harbour on the southern coast of Newfoundland. That rendezvous point is likely St. John's Harbour, or somewhere in that vicinity. Miguel's plan is methodical. Each ship explores different inlets, bays, rivers and islands, then return to the meeting place. 2 of the caravels return to that point on August 20th. Their captains describe cold winds, shifting ice, rough seas, fog, and desolate coastline. They wait day after day for Miguel's ship. Nothing comes. The crew wonders if he was caught in a storm, lost among ice floes, or wrecked on unknown reefs. The 3rd ship, bearing Miguel himself, fails to appear. The timeline ends here for Miguel. After August 20th, there is no record of his ship. No survivors drift ashore, no letters reach Portugal, nor do rumours of inland survival reach European ears. The 2 returning ships sail home, their decks empty of the lead ship's crew, their logs silent about Miguel's fate beyond the rendezvous failure. In 1503, Miguel's brother Vasco Anés Corte-Real petitioned for permission to mount a rescue voyage. the king refused to let Vasco sail, fearing he might suffer the same fate. He did, however, authorise 2 ships to go west in search of his missing brothers, but that expedition returns to Portugal with no trace. No bodies, no journals, no remains, only the sweeping Atlantic, unmoved by human hope. Over time, speculation blooms. Some claim Miguel was captured by indigenous peoples or died internally on board. Others propose he was lost to storms or ice. A more fanciful theory ties him to Dighton Rock, a boulder in present-day Massachusetts. In 1912 and again in 1928, Edmond de la Barre claimed inscriptions were Latin and included Miguel Corte-Real, 1511, suggesting he became a tribal chief. But later scholars dismissed those interpretations, citing lack of evidence and inaccuracies in the readings. Back in the archives, the last confirmed point in Miguel's story is the failed rendezvous on August 20th. The timeline stops there. Before that, the mission, departure, arrival in Newfoundland, separation, search. After that, only silence. The missing page is vast and deep. His ship disappeared between wind and wave, leaving behind only a broken schedule and empty sea lanes. The story of Miguel Corte-Real becomes a haunting echo in the map room. Charts bear coastlines labelled Terra dos Corte-Reis, or Land of Corte-Real, Codfish Land and Corte-Real Land. Cartographers annotate in margins, discovered 1501, search 1502, lost. But no routes stretch beyond that southern Newfoundland line. Beyond the charted coasts lies blank sea. Into that emptiness sailed Miguel, and he never returned. The map he helped to refine, the coastline he charted, the plans he left behind all speak to bold purpose. But the last line, where the map should show a return course, is blank. After August 20th, the voyage fades into nothingness. The 2 ships that returned carry grief, unanswered questions, and maps with mysterious edges. Miguel Corte-Real's fate rests in that silence. La Perouse Expedition, 1785 to 1788. We begin on a night in June 1788 under a stormlit sky. The 2 frigates, La Boussole and L'Astrolabe, lie battered and drenched, tossed by waves around the tiny islets of Vanikoro in the Solomon Archipelago. That is the last moment when eyewitness fragments and wreckage will surface. From there, we step into the inquiry room, where investigators across centuries assemble evidence, discard fantasies, and confront the thinnest scraps of fact. Jean-François de La Perouse left France in August 1785. Aboard these 2 ships, with artists, scientists, navigators, naturalists, some 220 souls aboard. Their mission, fill the gaps left by Cook, chart the Pacific, discover new lands, open routes, and build French prestige. The ships visited Brazil, Patagonia, Easter Island, Alaska, Asia, Japan, the Australian coast, and Kamchatka. After docking in Botany Bay in early 1788, they vanished. No letter returned. No ship sent from France could locate them. Their disappearance became one of the great mysteries of exploration. When the search began, rumours and reports circulated. Some thought La Perouse might have been lost near New Guinea. Others speculated about shipwrecks near islands unvisited by Europeans. But only one place gained traction, Vanikoro. In 1826, 27, the merchant captain Peter Dillon discovered traces washed ashore, cannons, anchors, metal fragments, and the haunting rumour among local islanders that 2 big ships had struck reef and that some survivors built a small boat and sailed away, leaving others behind. At Vanikoro, local tradition remembers that the wrecked French crew cut timbers from wreckage and island forests, built a 2-masted vessel, and after months launched it into the sea, perhaps aiming for Tahiti, but were never heard from again. Meanwhile, some survivors stayed and became entangled in local conflicts, according to oral accounts. In the inquiry room, evidence falls into 2 categories: archaeological finds and oral testimony, document fragments. On the archaeological side, from the 1960s onward, and especially through the efforts of the French Association Salomon, divers have located 2 primary wreck sites around Vanikoro, a fault/canyon zone and a reef/false pass zone. Items have been recovered: a sextant marked Mercier, matching an instrument listed as aboard Boussole, anchors, cannons, metal parts, fragments of hull, pulleys, copper, brass, rivets, tools, ceramics. These corroborate that both ships, Boussole and Astrolabe, were wrecked there. The distribution of debris suggests the hulls broke apart, the wrecks scattered by shifting reef and currents. A skeleton was found in 2003 or thereafter, remarkably preserved, perhaps one of the expedition's scientists or officers. Scientists attempted to match bones, isotopes, period clothing nails, but the identity remains unconfirmed. On the other side is testimony. Islanders tell of fires lit, palisades built, that they saw Europeans alive, walked among the wreck, salvaged stores, traded some objects, incorporated survivors temporarily, and then watched boats depart. These local memories passed across generations. French reports, logs from search voyages, captains' journals, and letters from 1791-94 expedition d'Entrecasteaux record that Vanikoro was known as locus of wreck. Dumont d'Urville, in the 1820s, followed Dillon's leads, visited Vanikoro, collected anchors and stories, and published interpretations. Yet in the inquiry room we must weigh what is firm and what is speculative. The sextant inscribed Mercier is strong proof linking one wreck to Boussole. The types of metal parts correspond to 18th century French naval gear. The spatial layout of the debris matches the expected size and orientation of two ships, but no intact hull was raised, no full log found, no definitive record of survivors' names. The skeleton was undated by inscription. The oral tradition is fragile, subject to distortion, time, translation, and local myth. Stories that some embarked and left in an improvised vessel may reflect real survivor attempts, but whether they succeeded or perished is unknown. Some locals say survivors lived among them decades. Others deny any long stay. Some early rescuers claim to find European tools inland or small structures, but later searches found no consistent footprints. Competing theories also swirl. One posits that one ship sank immediately, the other struck shallow reef and survivors managed to beach, build shelter, and perhaps survive years. Another theory suggests that all survivors died on Vanikoro, none sailed away. Others propose that some survivors were taken to other islands by local captors. In one version, La Perouse himself attempted to lead survivors across shelves to reach other French territories. But none of these theories is solid enough to declare with certainty. The timeline is also fragmentary. The fleet left Botany Bay around March 10, 1788. After that, no dispatch returns. The last certain point, they were sailing toward the Santa Cruz Solomon Islands region when they disappeared in mid-1788. It is likely they were caught in a cyclone or storm, struck reef or coral heads, and broke apart. Islanders claimed the ships broke in a dramatic night of wind and waves. Survivors may have washed ashore, built shelters in cleared forest, and stayed months building a vessel, but which months, who led them, and how many perished is unknown. In 1791-94, the French sent d'Entrecasteaux to search, finding nothing conclusive. In 1827, Dillon's visit yielded material evidence. Later, in early 19th century, Dumont d'Urville visited, collected artifacts, and made local interviews. In the 20th century, diving expeditions in the 1960s, 1980s, 1990s, and onward by Association Salomon refined the wreck site maps, recovered more artifacts, and in 2005 confirmed the sextant and other confident identifications. But questions remain. Which ship hit first? Which survivors built the raft? Did any reach elsewhere? Whose skeleton was found? Were some survivors assimilated into island communities? Thus, in the inquiry room, the case remains open. The evidence leans decisively toward Vanikoro wrecks. The artifacts and mapping align. The oral history supports stranded survivors, but the gaps are serious. Missing logs, names, full lists of crew remains, no ship manifest of survivors leaving. The silence keeps the mystery alive. As we exit the room, the walls lined with maps, torn charts, testimonials, artifact photos, we sense that La Perouse's expedition lies between fact and myth. The evidence we have, wreck sites, artifacts, village memory, is real and compelling. The theories woven around them, escape voyages, long survival, inland travel, are plausible but unproven. In that in-between, the story persists. Franklin's Northwest Passage Expedition, 1845. A winter silence fills the Arctic skies. Snow drifts across empty sea ice. The wind whispers across frozen waves. It is here we shift into the survivor's lens plus inquiry room, for the epic, tragic tale of Sir John Franklin's 1845 Northwest Passage expedition, how the ships vanished, how Inuit voices preserved scraps of truth, and how modern discovery pieced together the wrecks of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. John Franklin departed England on the 19th of May 1845, commanding 2 ships, the Erebus, his flagship, and Terror, with 129 officers and men aboard. The plan: sail west from Baffin Bay, navigate through the uncharted Arctic passages, and emerge in the Pacific. Both vessels were heavily refitted, steam engines, iron plating, extra stores. The mission combined science and ambition, chart magnetic data, map Arctic coasts, and complete the Northwest Passage crossing. In the early months, the ships were last seen in August 1845 by whalers in Baffin Bay as they pushed north. After that, no European contact. The expedition slipped into the unknown. From the survivors' angle, we must lean on Inuit testimony. In years following the disappearance, Arctic peoples preserved memory of encountering or observing fragments of the expedition's remains. In 1860, the explorer Elisha Kent Kane and later Charles Francis Hall employed Inuit guides Ipirvik and Takulituk to collect accounts. These oral histories form a dark mirror. They tell of 2 ships crushed in ice, of skeletons seen on the land, of men dragging boats, of tins left abandoned, of cannibalism whispered on the wind. One Inuit man named Niwikitu showed Hall a watch he claimed to have taken from a dead European body. He said that bodies lay near the shore of a large island not far from their camps, men moving from a ship crushed in ice. These testimony fragments were badly treated in European circles at first. Victorian society recoiled at the idea of explorers resorting to cannibalism. Some dismissed Inuit accounts as barbaric fantasy. Yet decades later, forensic study of bones recovered near King William Island showed cut marks consistent with butchery, bones fractured for marrow, with signs of extreme nutritional stress. That evidence echoes the horror woven into the Inuit stories. Turning to the inquiry room, we now assemble physical evidence, archival clues, and modern discovery. In 1859, searcher Francis Leopold McClintock found 2 cairn messages at Victory Point on King William Island. These were abandoned deck notes left by survivors before departing southward on foot. One message, dated 1847, stated, "Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June 1847. The total loss by deaths, 9 officers, 15 men. We start on the 26th of April for Back's Fish River." That was the last written trace from the Franklin Command. After 170 years of searches and hypotheses, the breakthrough came in September 2014, when archaeologists working in partnership with Parks Canada and Inuit communities located the wreck of HMS Erebus in Wilmot and Crampton Bay, just south of King William Island. 2 years later, in September 2016, the wreck of HMS Terror was located in Terror Bay, off the southwest coast of the same island. The finds were positioned in depths and locations consistent with Inuit knowledge passed down through generations, validating that oral tradition guided modern searchers. Artifacts recovered from Erebus include pistols, sealed medicine bottles, chests, navigation instruments, and personal items. Each object is recorded in situ, its position, orientation, and condition carefully logged to reconstruct how the ship may have sunk and what life was like in her holds. The ships today are designated the wrecks of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror National Historic Site, jointly managed by Parks Canada and Inuit Guardians. The pattern of wreckage is revealing. The Erebus lies in shallower water, oriented roughly northeast-southwest, showing signs of structural collapse. The Terror is more intact, in deeper water and near reef edges. The spatial spread of artifacts, metal fragments, hull elements, tools, and personal belongings suggests that each vessel grounded, broke, and was battered over time by shifting ice and currents. But mysteries remain. Which ship was abandoned first? How long did survivors remain aboard? How many attempted escape? Did some make it ashore and try to march southwards? Inuit accounts suggest they saw European men crossing ice, dragging boats on sledges, walking toward the land. A few elders described seeing skeletons near open tents, skeletons partially butchered, lines where campfires had burned. But whether those were survivors from the ships or later search parties is unresolved. In the inquiry room, we weigh conflicting clues. McClintock's message suggests the men left the ships in April 1848. The oral testimonies and bones show signs of long exposure and desperation. The wreck locations match drift models from the abandonment site. But no definitive logbooks from later months exist. No survivor testified. No definitive chain connects artifact to individual identity, beyond inscriptions on a few tins or navigation instruments matched to ship inventory. The survivor's lens tightens. Imagine freezing nights in dim cabins, dwindling food, bodies wasted by scurvy. The men likely faced hypothermia, starvation, frostbite. Inuit accounts tell of cannibalism under extreme duress. Research published in recent years confirms that a subset of bones found on the islands bear cut marks and fractures consistent with disarticulation and marrow extraction. That supports the oral testimony, though detail and scale remain debated. One recent scientific result is the identification by DNA of Captain James Fitzjames as one of the skeletons uncovered on King William Island. Fitzjames served aboard Erebus and carried the last known message. That identification connects name to remains, giving human face to the Arctic tragedy. He likely perished among the last group attempting to trek toward the Back River. The blending of survivor testimony and inquiry evidence reveals a layered picture, not clean or certain, but powerful. Inuit voices, once dismissed by many, are now acknowledged as central to the discovery and interpretation of the wrecks. Oral histories shaped search zones, guided sonar sweeps, and narrowed possibilities. Without that knowledge, explorers likely would have missed both wrecks. Yet in the remains and ice, silence persists. How exactly each vessel settled, how long survivors clung to hope, how far they travelled over tundra or ice is partly hidden from us. The last written line ends in April 1848. The body of men descends into bone and artifact. We step out of the room, the walls lined with maps, bones, sonar images, Inuit drawings, expedition logs, and walk back into the howling Arctic night, where the story continues to echo. San Lesmes, 1526. The Loaiza expedition, launched in 1525 under Garcia Jofre de Loaiza, set out from Spain with 7 ships. Their mission, to reach the Spice Islands, relieve or find the Trinidad of Magellan's earlier voyage, and strengthen Spain's hold in the east. Among that fleet sailed the caravel San Lesmes, under command of Francisco de Oches, with perhaps 50 to 60 men aboard. The expedition followed the Atlantic south, rounded Cape Horn or Strait of Magellan, and in May 1526 entered the Pacific with 4 ships remaining. But the Pacific proved unforgiving. Storms, seas, and navigational confusion scattered the vessels. The San Lesmes was cast off, lost to its companions in a fierce gale. That is the last firm moment in the archive. In late May 1526, San Lesmes was seen no more. From official Spanish records, the later fate of San Lesmes is absent. There is no surviving log, no reports of salvage or return. The archival trace ends abruptly when the caravel, separated, drifts into the unknown. The gap in Spanish chronicles is total. This blankness gives room for myth, hypotheses, rumour and conjecture to flourish. Over time, scholars and enthusiasts have proposed various fates. One theory, most elaborated by researcher Robert Langdon in The Lost Caravel and The Lost Caravel Re-Explored, suggests that San Lesmes drifted northwest, struck reefs in the Tuamotu archipelago, perhaps at Amanu Atoll, and that the survivors then integrated into Polynesian life, leaving biological and cultural traces across the Pacific, perhaps even reaching New Zealand or Easter Island. In support of this, in the early 20th century and mid-1900s, European explorers claimed to find cannons and metal fragments in Tuamotu reef sites. On Amanu, a cross on the beach and oral stories of a shipwreck generations earlier stirred imaginations. Islanders reportedly spoke of white strangers, iron tools, and odd stones not local to the reef. Some genealogies, linguistic resemblances, or physical traits among islanders, lighter hair, blue eyes, have been suggested, though controversial, as echoing European mingling. Roger Hervé, a French map scholar, proposed that San Lesmes might have ventured even farther, to Tasmania, New Zealand, or the east coast of Australia, before being captured or lost. Some early maps show phantom landmasses or names like San Lesmes or Isles of Lesmes in regions south of Polynesia. But such maps are often speculative, copied from rumours. Still, myth has teeth. Advocates point to anomalous features in some Polynesian cultures, use of masonry or stone artifacts outside local traditions, European-style boat constructions in oral memory, uncommon words similar to Spanish. In New Zealand, some Maori language words like pataka, resembling patata, or kaipuka, ship, attract speculative note, though mainstream linguistics sees them as coincidental or later borrowing. We return to the archive. Spanish dispatches, logs of other Loaiza ships, letters from the survivors who reached the Spice Islands. Those documents mention only the disappearance of San Lesmes, with no detail of wreck, survivors, or further voyage. Spanish casualties were heavy. Only 24 men of the original 450 survived back to Spain, but none reported encountering castaways from San Lesmes in the Pacific. The archive thus offers a bare skeleton, a date of separation, May 1526, a missing ship, no further European reference. Everything else lies in stories passed from island mouth to island site, in canon finds, in map annotations, in local traditions. In the myth verses, archive balance, the archive is silent and stark. Myth is expansive and alluring. Which side holds truth? Probably somewhere between. It is plausible that the San Lesmes was wrecked near a reef in the Tuamatus, where cannons and metal could remain. It is also plausible survivors sought refuge, lived with islanders, intermarried, their traces diluted over generations. But proposals that they reached New Zealand, Tasmania, or influenced native societies at large face steep challenges. No firm archaeological link, no verified DNA signatures, no conclusive artifact chains. Ocean currents, navigation difficulty, supply limits, and isolation make long voyages improbable for a stranded 16th century caravel and crew. Scholars cautious of myth emphasise that the found cannons may not even date from the 16th century. They could be later shipwrecks misattributed to San Lesmes. Oral traditions may conflate multiple shipwreck memories. Cultural traits like lighter hair can emerge through drift, admixture, or later European contacts after Cook's voyages. The linguistic Spanish-looking words may be coincidences or later loanwords. Maps bearing phantom Lesmes Islands could originate in sailor hearsay or cartographic inventions rather than real crew reports. In the archive, we also find that Francisco de Hoces has a footnote in history. In January 1526, San Lesmes was reportedly driven southward by gale to 56 degrees S latitude, where the crew claimed to see an open sea beyond, as if glimpsing a southern waterway beyond Tierra del Fuego, a precursor, some say, to discovery of the Drake Passage, but that account is debated and likely exaggerated. Thus, the figure of San Lesmes sits between two worlds, in archival darkness and in mythic light. The archive gives us who, when, where, and then the line stops. Myth picks up, reaching into Pacific reefs, island legends, cannons, genetic whispers, phantom maps. We stand between those two, tracing the outlines of a story no one could fully recover. We shift the camera into the ocean, tossing over reefs, islets, and lagoon edges, following currents that could have carried a damaged caravel, imagining men stepping ashore into strange skies. In that space, archive and myth overlap. The last known sighting, the scattered artifacts, the island tales, the speculative maps, all pointing to a vessel lost in the Pacific, a crew lost to time, and a story still debated between silence and supposition. Sir Hugh Willoughby, 1553. In the summer of 1553, 3 English ships left the River Thames under the banner of the newly formed Company of Merchant Adventurers, later known as the Muscovy Company. Their goal was to find a northern sea route to Asia, a passage over the top of the world that could connect England to the riches of the East without crossing Spanish-controlled waters. The fleet was commanded by Sir Hugh Willoughby, a man of courage and discipline but with little experience in navigation. His flagship was the Bona Esperanza, followed by the Edward Bonaventure under Richard Chancellor and the Bona Confidentia. They departed with enthusiasm and ceremony, carrying letters from King Edward VI and detailed instructions. The ships were strongly built, triple-masted, and provisioned for 2 years. They carried enough food, coal, and woolen clothing to face the northern cold, as well as charts that outlined the coasts of Norway and the vague outlines of lands beyond. The confidence of the merchants and officers was high. Few had seen Arctic ice, and fewer still understood the kind of winter that lay ahead. The voyage began smoothly, but after rounding the northern tip of Norway in July, the weather changed. The Barentsz Sea, uncharted and treacherous, rose against them with sudden winds and freezing rain. Fog enveloped the ships for days, breaking only for violent squalls that tore sails and pushed the fleet apart. Somewhere off the Lofoten coast, the Edward Bonaventure became separated from the others. Chancellor, on the Edward, made for the planned meeting point at Vardo, near the edge of the known world. He waited for weeks, but Willoughby and his 2 ships never arrived. What followed can be reconstructed only from fragments. Willoughby's Bona Esperanza and the Bona Confidentia continued east, trying to rejoin Chancellor. With poor visibility, faulty compasses and ice forming around the hulls, they drifted further into the Arctic. By late August, daylight shortened, temperatures plunged, and the men began to realise they were trapped in seas no European ship had ever endured. The masts iced over, rigging froze, and navigation became guesswork. Their hulls, built for the Atlantic, were no match for the shifting pressure of polar ice. When it became clear they could not reach open water, the 2 ships turned back and looked for shelter. They found a small bay on the Kola Peninsula, likely near the mouth of the Varzina River, and dropped anchor as the first snow began to fall. Here they would wait out the winter. The choice was understandable. Sailing farther risked being crushed by ice, yet that decision would seal their fate. The cold grew unbearable. The sun disappeared below the horizon for weeks at a time. The men sealed hatches and closed off ventilation to keep heat from their stoves from escaping. Smoke leaked through cracks, filling the cabins. The heat gave some relief, but the air grew heavy, thin, and deadly. Food began to rot or freeze solid. Fresh water ran out. Hunting was impossible in the endless dark. By midwinter, frostbite and scurvy spread through the crews. The constant dampness turned clothes stiff and skin black with sores. Some men may have tried to leave the ship to find shelter on land, but there were no villages nearby, only frozen tundra and wolves. Those who stayed likely weakened slowly, overcome by cold and carbon monoxide from their own fires. The cabins became silent. When spring came, Russian fishermen travelling along the coast noticed 2 ships lying at anchor in still water. They approached cautiously and climbed aboard. Inside they found the crews dead, frozen where they had sat or lain. Some were at tables with papers and journals, others by the stove, as if asleep. Sir Hugh Willoughby was among them. The ships were intact, provisions still aboard, sails torn but recognisable. It appeared that no one had left. The fishermen reported the find, and 2 years later an English recovery expedition arrived. They took Willoughby's journal and attempted to bring the ships home. During the voyage south, storms struck again, and both ships sank off Norway. Only a handful of documents survived, including the logbook that chronicled their slow drift into the Arctic and their final anchorage. The physical evidence told a clear story of failure through a chain of design, weather, and human factors. The ships were sturdy but not insulated against Arctic cold. Their ventilation systems were primitive, allowing heat to escape but trapping fumes when sealed. The men were sailors of temperate seas, not polar explorers. They lacked knowledge of how to build wind shelters, conserve fuel, or recognise the dangers of burning coal in confined spaces. Weather was the dominant force. The sudden gales of the Barentsz Sea drove them from planned routes. Ice formed earlier than expected, locking them into a bay before they could escape. Freezing temperatures made the simplest tasks dangerous. Without sunlight, time lost all rhythm. Morale must have faded into confusion and resignation. Human choices magnified these problems. In the struggle to survive, the crew likely blocked every vent and sealed the hatches to trap warmth. In doing so, they also sealed in carbon monoxide, poisoning themselves without realising it. The logs mention the extreme cold and the difficulty of breathing in smoky air. The combination of exhaustion, hunger, and gas exposure would have made men drift into sleep they could not wake from. By the time the ice broke in spring, nothing stirred on the decks. Their flags hung motionless, their ropes frozen like iron. The fishermen who discovered them described an eerie calm. The ships at perfect anchor, crew frozen at their posts, papers fluttering faintly in the wind. It was as if time had stopped. From the fragments of Willoughby's journal, historians pieced together the order of events: the departure, the storm, the separation, the failed wintering. The cause was not one single mistake, but the convergence of human limitation, poor design, and nature's indifference. The Arctic, indifferent to courage or ambition, had closed its grip before any of them could react. The story of Sir Hugh Willoughby's expedition spread through Europe as both tragedy and lesson. The Muscovy Company would continue its ventures, now aware of the cost of underestimating the northern seas. The fate of those two ships in the Silent Bay stands as one of the earliest recorded Arctic disasters, a reminder of how design, weather, and human endurance can meet in perfect and fatal balance. Willem Barentsz, Third Voyage, 1596 to 1597. Ice cracks, stars wheel overhead, and a crew huddles in gathering shadow. This is no planned landing, no calm port. It is the harsh theatre of survival, and here we live through the third voyage of Willem Barentsz, from his crew's eyes in their words and pains. As their ship dies, their hope is tested, and only a few return. Willem Barentsz set out in 1596 with two vessels seeking the fabled Northeast Passage. He was pilot and navigator. Jacob van Heemskerk captained alongside. Jan Rijp commanded a third ship that broke away early and turned back. Barentsz and his companions pushed north of Novaya Zemlya, discovering Spitsbergen on the way. As they rounded the northern tip of Novaya Zemlya, ice closed in. The ships became beset by drift, shackled by the sea itself. Their wooden hulls, strained by cold and pressure, cracked under shifting floes. They realised they had no choice but to winter near the Arctic coast. The crew salvaged planks, nails, tools, tar from their crushed ship and from floating debris, and began constructing a shelter on the barren shore. They named it Het Behouden Huis, the saved house. It would become their only refuge for 10 brutal months. From the diary of Gerrit de Veer, the crew carpenter, we hear the daily struggle. They slept on warmed stones and cannonballs. Their wool and linen garments muffled frost but could not beat it entirely. They made new clothing from sails, blankets, old canvas. Their food stores of salted meat, beans, bread, cheese dwindled steadily. Casks of beer froze, bursting. Wine was rationed. By November, supplies ran low. De Veer described frozen gear, stiffened limbs, breath that froze on beards. They hunted fur seals and Arctic foxes, trapping where they could. The fur-bearers' hides gave meat, oil and warmth. The raw flesh of polar fox, though tough, delivered trace vitamin C, a hidden lifeline against scurvy. As the long dark deepened, their senses dulled. Shadows lengthened. They saw mirages over the ice, distant lights misread as campfires, shapes shifting in wind. Polar bears stalked near the shelter. Night after night the men heard their padded steps on ice, their roars echoing. The bears scavenged wreckage, pried loose boards, investigated their work. Firearms misfired in cold, gunpowder dampened. Some bears were killed only after repeated shots. The stress of cold, hunger and constant danger wore on every man. When dawn returned in spring, the ice still gripped the coast. They waited. Some tried repairs, others hunted for driftwood. But the path to open sea remained blocked. In June 1597, the crew decided to abandon shelter and attempt to return by 2 small open boats. Barentsz was already weak. Some men forced him aboard a boat despite his condition. The group navigated along the coast, labouring across shifting icefields and frigid seas. On the 20th of June 1597, Barentsz died. Whether in the boat or shortly before, the record cannot say. His last days were consumed by exhaustion, malnutrition, cold, and the weight of leadership. The tiny flotilla carried onward without him, their captain gone. Only 12 men survived to reach the Kola Peninsula. They were rescued by a merchant ship commanded by Jan Rijp, who had returned home but sailed again. In the end, these survivors landed in civilization, battered, changed forever. Through the survivor's lens, we feel every shiver, every hunger pang, every moment when hope flickered and threatened to die. We see them huddled in their wooden hut, the wind howling across ice ridges, snow piling at doors, the cold stealing voices and strength. We feel the disappointment when another supply chest is empty, the horror when a comrade succumbs. We sense the fatigue as they dismantled parts of their ship for wood, used rope fibres for patches, burned scraps for fire. They observed the sky too. Solar declination entries in their journals confirm they used astronomy to track time. They watched a strange mirage effect, sunlight distorted across ice, a phenomenon later named the Novaya Zemlya effect. They recorded a conjunction of Jupiter and the Moon in January, where the planets should have been hidden by daylight. The effect of refraction across cold air layers allowed them to observe celestial bodies they should not have seen. The men measured latitude despite overcast skies. Their readings had error margins of 15 to 20 arc minutes, but they were consistent with their journal entries. That careful record-keeping helped future explorers place their winter camp and trace their route, but maps and instruments could not save them. After Barentsz died, the survivors steered southward, hugging the shoreline. They navigated around fjords and islands, bringing their small boats through ice-laden passages. Their hands cracked by cold, bodies weakened by scurvy, they rowed in silence, leaning on memories of land and life. When they reached open waters, chances improved. Yet the sea was still cold, the current strong, the wind capricious. They landed on the mainland, hungry and spent. Jan Rijp's ship found them by chance and carried them home. In later decades, the remains of Het Behouden Huis were discovered in 1871 by Norwegian captain Elling Carlsen. In that shelter were copper pots, a tool chest, fragments of cloth, a clock, artifacts of survival. The structure lay untouched for centuries, preserving its testament to human endurance. The bones of the dead, the journals of the living, the tools and utensils, each item echoes the hardship, the resolve, the desperation, and the long dark through which Barentz's crew passed. In their retreat across ice and sea, in their struggle against nature and mortality, we see the raw face of Arctic survival. James Knight's Northwest Passage bid, 1719. In 1719, 2 ships left England under the command of James Knight, a seasoned trader and governor of Hudson's Bay Company posts. He was over 70 years old, yet determined to attempt what generations before him had failed to achieve, the discovery of a navigable Northwest Passage. His expedition, made up of the Albany and the Discovery, was to sail through Hudson Bay and push beyond its frozen edges, searching for a western route to the Pacific and for rumoured deposits of precious metals. Around 40 men joined the voyage, most of them seamen and tradesmen accustomed to northern climates but not to the extremes that awaited them. They sailed from Gravesend in June. At first, reports followed them to the Orkneys and north toward Greenland's ice. From there, silence. The Hudson's Bay Company expected their arrival the following year but received nothing. No letters, no messengers, no cargo, not even wreckage. After 2 winters without word, the company assumed the worst. In 1721 and again in 1722, ships were sent north to search, but they found no trace of Knight or his crew. By the end of that decade, both vessels were officially declared lost with all hands. Almost 50 years later, in 1767, traces finally surfaced. Travellers and traders in the Western Arctic heard Inuit stories of 2 large ships that had come into trouble on a rocky island far out in Hudson Bay. The ships had run aground near a low coastline covered in white stone. The survivors had built huts from wood and stone and lived there through the winter, but sickness and starvation overtook them. The place was called Marble Island, and when explorers finally visited it, they found scattered evidence that matched those old accounts. There were timbers from ships, rusted cannon, bricks and coal, and remnants of European tools. Fragments of rope and iron nails lay half buried in gravel. Near the higher ground stood the remains of a small structure built from stone and ship planking, large enough to have housed a few men. The bones of animals lay nearby, seal, caribou, and bear, showing that the castaways had tried to hunt. No human skeletons were found in full, but isolated fragments of bone suggested shallow graves or exposure to the elements. Inuit elders who visited with the explorers said their ancestors remembered the strangers who lived and died there. Some said the men built 2 boats to leave the island but were lost in the ice. Others said none had survived the second winter. The story pieced together from these fragments shows that Knight's ships likely struck shoals near Marble Island and were trapped or wrecked by the shifting ice. The crews managed to come ashore with supplies. Coal piles indicate they brought fuel from the ships, perhaps to melt snow for water or to heat their shelter. They may have believed rescue would come from the Hudson's Bay posts to the south, but no relief ever arrived. Winter descended, sealing the bay in ice. Scurvy would have set in after the fresh food ran out. Cold weakened them further. By the second year, starvation and disease would have thinned their numbers. Archaeologists studying the site centuries later found the same pattern of survival debris. Metal objects repurposed as tools, charred bones, the remains of fireplaces, and small pieces of pottery. Inuit testimony complements these finds. Stories handed down through generations describe local families visiting the stranded men, trading small game for knives or metal, and later returning to find their camp deserted. One account tells of men dying as they tried to cross the ice toward the mainland. Another says the last survivor was found dead beside the remains of a fire. Different theories compete to explain exactly how and when the end came. One suggests that both ships were damaged early and the survivors never managed to repair them. Another imagines that they survived one full winter, perhaps even two, before scurvy and cold claimed them. A few researchers have proposed that they succumbed to trichinosis after eating undercooked polar bear meat, a common danger among desperate Arctic crews. But there is no conclusive physical evidence to confirm any single cause. All that can be said with certainty is that they died isolated, far from any help. Their shelter on Marble Island was built with skill and planning, which shows they expected to endure for some time. The supplies they carried, coal, bricks, ironwork, proved that the expedition had prepared for wintering, but the northern conditions overwhelmed their resources. The ice around the island forms early and remains thick well into summer, cutting off escape. Ships of that era, even well built, could not survive being frozen in place. When later expeditions came searching, they found the area littered with traces of wreckage and tools still being used by local Inuit. The story of the white men who died on the island became part of local oral history, passed from generation to generation. These stories preserved details unknown to written archives, descriptions of the two ships, the strange materials they brought, and the way the men struggled to build shelter before the sea froze around them. Every piece of evidence, from scattered metal to remembered story, fits within the same grim outline. Two ships lost in Hudson Bay, their crews forced to overwinter on a barren island of white stone, building fires that could not keep them alive. No message home, no survivor to tell the full story. Only the slow work of archaeologists, the preserved tools, and the memories of Arctic communities give shape to what happened. The rest is silence, broken only by the wind that still sweeps over Marble Island. USS Jeannette, 1879-81. A pale Arctic dawn glitters across a frozen sea. Men shiver against wind, ice scraping wood. This is the world of USS Jeannette's doomed voyage, seen through the eyes of those who lived it and died in its cold grip. Captain George W. DeLong set sail on the 8th of July 1879 from San Francisco, aboard the vessel formerly known as HMS Pandora, now refitted and renamed Jeannette. His goal, to find a route northward via the Bering Strait, hoping a warm current from the Pacific would lead into a mysterious open polar sea. 33 men joined him, naval officers, engineers, scientists, sailors, equipped with ambitious plans and delicate instruments. They passed through the Bering Strait, moving north. By September, Jeannette had entered the Arctic Ocean beyond Siberia, encountering dense pack ice. The ice closed in, pinning the ship. She drifted for months, caught in the shifting grip of cold. The crew hunted seals, shot polar bears, tried to keep morale high. They carried out meteorological observations, logged sea and ice data, tried repairs, patched leaks, listened for the faint spring thaw. In January 1880, the ship began leaking. Cracks appeared in the hull under pressure. The engineer, George Melville, and others waded into freezing water to stuff leaks, build patching systems, install a bulkhead. These heroic efforts kept Jeannette afloat through the long winter, but the pressure of ice seldom let them breathe easy. The drift carried them northwest over icy currents. Spring 1881 brought hope. They sighted islands, Henrietta and Jeannette Islands, and landed small parties to claim territory, map coastline, rest. Yet any promise of freedom slipped away. On the 11th of June 1881, the ice freed momentarily but closed again with force. The hull was crushed. The order came, abandon ship. Over days they transferred boats, sleds, supplies onto the ice. By the 13th of June 1881, Jeannette sank into the Arctic Sea. The crew stood on ice staring at their lost vessel. For a moment the ice held firm, then it began to fracture. They loaded 3 small boats, a cutter under DeLong, a whaleboat, and another cutter under Lieutenant Chip. They towed sledges, dragged supplies across broken ice, pressed toward land promised beyond the horizon. DeLong's party began a long march toward the Lena Delta in Siberia. They travelled across ice and open water, alternating between sledging and sailing. They passed Bennett Island, skirting new Siberian islands. Their bodies were weakened by cold, hunger, scurvy. Some of the crew died along the way. Melville's boat party broke from DeLong's route and reached a Siberian settlement. He arranged to notify authorities and return with help. Chip's cutter never made land. It was lost in storm. 8 men vanished. DeLong's party fared worse. After burning strength, rations, hopes, few remained. In October 1881 he recorded last entries, men slipping away one by one. On the 30th of October 1881 his journal ends, the last names of officers dying, a final note of grief. Only 13 of the 33 survived to reach safety. DeLong, Ambler, the surgeon, Collins, the naturalist, and others perished. Their bodies were later found, logged, and buried by Melville's rescue search. The tools, maps, journals, and artifacts they left behind would inform science and exploration for generations. Through the eyes of men who lived that ordeal, we hear the cold, the ratcheting ice, the crackle of drift fractures, the bone ache. We feel the fatigue, pulling sleds, rowing across open leads, cutting through slush, rationing food, drinking warmed snow, wrapping frostbitten fingers, staring at distant land that never seems to draw nearer. We sense muttered prayers, whispered hope, despair as companions collapse and die. We hear conversations about what to leave behind, how far one more leg might carry them, whether rescue might come. We see the flicker of candles in darkness, the trembling fingers recording position readings, the hunting parties returning with seal, the shore parties planting flags, the men standing around a drifting cairn, the final note left in a bottle or cache. We feel the agony when the hull finally gives, when the ice crushes, water surges, wood creaks, men scramble, boats float off, only to be surrounded by sea and ice. In this world, time stretches, days, weeks, months. The line between life and death blurs. DeLong and his men kept journals until their final hours. His last pages read names fading, voices dimming, bodies failing. And long before cold claimed them, hope flickered out. From that drift and journey emerge maps, logs, science, and memorial. But in the voices of survivors, in broken sentences, in half-erased entries, lies the raw core. A voyage that sank not just a ship, but many lives, washed into the Arctic's cold and never returned. Carluk, Canadian Arctic Expedition flagship, 1913 to 1914. The Carluk left Alaska in summer 1913, part of the ambitious Canadian Arctic expedition led by Vilhjalmur Stephenson. Her route was toward Herschel Island, where she would rendezvous with other vessels. On board were explorers, scientists, Inuit hunters, crew, 25 souls in all. The ship itself was a wooden whaler refitted for Arctic service, carrying both sail and auxiliary steam power. By August 1913, the Carluk was trapped by pack ice in the Beaufort Sea, some 300 kilometres short of her target. The ice gripped her hull, and though the crew tried to free her, the drift began. Instead of moving east toward the rendezvous, the Carluk drifted westward, driven by wind and current. Stephenson, believing he could gather food and supplies, left the ship on a hunting trip, telling Captain Robert Bartlett to winter aboard and wait. But as Stephenson went ashore, the ice eased the ship away. He never returned to Carluk. The ship remained locked in ice through the dark Arctic months. The drift carried her across treacherous distances, past islands, over shifting floes. The men aboard attempted to maintain order, hunt seals and whales through holes in the ice, preserve provisions, conserve strength. Several attempted sledge journeys, scouting for leads or finding land, but none succeeded permanently. The cold pressed in, and the tensions of survival weighed heavily. In January 1914, the pressure of the ice overwhelmed the ship. At first, a tremor jolted the passengers. The hull cracked, planking split, water entered the engine room, the pumps could not keep up. On the 11th of January, Carluk sank beneath the ice. The crew transferred to ice floes, carrying what supplies and gear they could. The date of sinking marks the last moment of the ship's existence. From that moment, the survivors lived on drifting ice, constantly threatened by lead cracks and pressure ridges. After weeks of drift, they made for land. Some walked, pulling sledges. In March or early April 1914, 17 survivors reached Wrangel Island, off the Siberian coast. On that rocky, barren ground they attempted to survive. hunting, sheltering, rationing, maintaining hope. Captain Bartlett, believing help must come, assembled a small party with an Inuit hunter, Kaduktovik, and set out across the ice towards Siberia to fetch rescue. Their journey covered hundreds of kilometres over broken ice and open leads. They reached the Siberian coast, arranged for a rescue steamer, and returned with help. On the 7th of September 1914, the survivors left Wrangel Island aboard the schooner King and Winge and the Cutter Bear. 11 of the original 25 perished, some in the drift on the ice, some on Wrangel Island, and some during the rescue march. Among them were scientists, Inuit hunters, crew. Internal strife, food shortage, exposure and despair contributed. One death on Wrangel was by gunshot. Whether accident, suicide, or conflict remains unresolved. Debate continues over Stephenson's decision to leave the ship and criticisms of expedition leadership. Throughout the timeline, from trapping in ice, drifting westward, sinking, survival on ice, the land march, and final rescue, the Carluk voyage marks one of the most dramatic vanishings in Arctic history. Brusilov Expedition, Sviataya Anna, 1912 to 1914. The expedition set off in late 1912 from Alexandrovsk, Siberia. Captain Georgy Brusilov commanded the brig Sviataya Anna, aiming to traverse the Northeast Passage. Among his crew was the navigator Valerian Albanov and, unusually, a young nurse Yerminia Jdanko, one of the few women in polar service. Supplies were loaded, charts studied, hopes high, though time was short. Ice would come soon. By October 1912, the ship was already locked in the pack ice off the Yamal Peninsula in the Kara Sea. That autumn, the ice refused to release her. Instead of freeing and moving forward, she drifted, caught in the slow currents of a polar prison. The crew wintered over, expecting the thaw to let them go again. When spring came in 1913, ice still held firm. Supplies, abundant at first, began to stretch. Rations were cut, hunting parties sent out. Men hunted seals, walrus, and fished through leads in the ice. Snowdrifts built around the hull, cold blanketed the men. Brusilov himself began to suffer from illness and scurvy, weakened by months of darkness and weak diet. Drift carried Sviataya Anna northward. By 1914, the ship had moved far past the western edges of Franz Josef Land. The ice floes guided her in lazy arcs, sometimes turning east, sometimes west. The men recorded their latitude and longitude when skies cleared. When not, they guessed from drift, wind, and residual navigation. The ship sometimes tilted, hull stressed, planks creaked. By spring 1914, conditions were dire. The ship had been drifting for over a year and a half. The hope of release faded. Only fragments of orientation remained. Isolated land sightings, sky readings, drift behaviour. They saw open leads, smells of water, flashes of sea beyond ice, but no consistent path. The Sviataya Anna's crew saw their world reduced to ice, wind, and survival. That year, Albanov requested permission to leave. He believed continuing on the ship would condemn all to a slow death. He proposed to travel south toward Northbrook Island in Franz Josef Land, where prior expeditions had left caches and huts. Brusilov, gravely ill, agreed for a party to depart, though he remained on the ship with the majority. Albanov gathered 13 others, including Alexander Conrad, outfits of sledges, skis, kayaks. On the 14th of April 1914, they left the ship to begin their trek. Their route was brutal. They travelled over broken ice, between cracks and ridges, crossing polynias, open water areas, by kayak or sledge. Many days they never saw solid ground. Snow piled high, blizzards struck. Disorientation plagued them, supplies failed, some died along the path. They journeyed southwest, hoping to reach Cape Flora, where the explorer Frederick George Jackson had left a hut and supplies. After about 90 days of travel, only Albanov and Conrad survived. The others perished from exposure, starvation, or falling through ice. They reached Cape Flora, hailed by salvation. Their trackers had been found by the ship Sviatoy Foka, part of the Sedov rescue expedition, which arrived just in time. Meanwhile, Sviataya Anna, with Brusilov and the remainder, continued drifting. She disappeared. The ship was never seen again. No rescue ever found her, no wreckage confirmed. Only fragments of logs and personal effects later emerged on the shores of Franz Josef Land. In 2010, explorers recovered a skeletal remain, sections of logs from May 1913, a watch, snowshoes, a knife and a spoon with a sailor's initials, objects matching descriptions in Albanov's memoirs. These finds affirmed the drift timeline and suggested the ship may have succumbed to ice crush or sank after breaking apart. Albanov's memoir, In the Land of White Death, paints small scenes, men in cabins keeping watch, rationing meat, smoking tobacco until final match. He notes a last brick of tobacco in May 1913. He describes salvage of ship materials, use of rigging for ropes, repurposing of tools. He describes the mood, once confident sailor voices giving way to whispers, to tremors, to broken longing for home. In the slow months, the men on Sviataya Anna saw ice shift, pressure zones bend the ship, planks loosen, seams leak. They saw small cracks in the ice outside the hull, heard groans at night. Men grew weak. Walking on decks became labour. Hunting became dangerous. Polar bears, drifting leads, hidden pressure ridges. Some fell through cracks, others died in cabins. Injuries and illness spread. Men rationed fuel for heating boiled snow, but sometimes coal ran low. Cold stole body strength, mind steadiness. The drifting ship touched latitudes above 83 degrees north, one of the farthest measured in the Arctic drift for a manned vessel at the time. The drift carried Sviataya Anna northwest into remote seas. The men logged their positions when possible. Most times they estimated from drift and wind, their floats, their navigation tools, maps of Nansen as reference. They tried to align what they saw in sky with phantom maps. Sometimes they glimpsed uncharted coastlines or shadows of land on horizon, but never distinct shelter or rescue. As they drifted, the supply stock fluctuated. The hunting yields were erratic. Some months brought seal, others brought nothing. Blubber was boiled for fat, but the fat was imperfect for fuel or food. They burned spirit lamps, but fuel containers froze. Some food cans bulged or sprung leaks. Spirits were wasted or given up. Weakness crept. Scurvy attacked gums and limbs. Bruises and bleeding were signs of nutritional collapse. During that drift, the crew buried dead men on floes or on small ice shelves. Names, dates, initials were etched on wooden planks, but ice moved. Graves may have been carried away, submerged, broken. When later relics washed ashore on islands, those names were gone. Possessions remained. The skeletal remains found later did not carry clear inscription. They were fragments. The two survivors' journey forms a mirror to the ship's fate. While Sviataya Anna drifted lost, Albanov and Conrad crossed ice and sea, navigating by scant maps and sky, fighting hunger, cold, bleak nights, hidden leads, exhaustion. Their arrival at Cape Flora, their rescue by Sviatoi Foka, was miraculous. They carried with them names, dates, drift logs, observations, and the memory of their fellow crewmen lost to the ice. The Sviataya Anna's final resting place is unknown. Some propose she was crushed by ice and sank. Others suggest deep drift and sinking later. The fragments found in 2010 confirm parts of her interior and last logs. The last journal pages, discovered in May 1913, show the men still had tobacco, matches, morale, barely. After that, entries fade. In the timeline, depart 1912, freeze 1912, drift 1913, leave 1914, survivors walk out, ship vanishes beyond. The last sighting was the ship frozen in ice. The last journal date, May 1913. The last object found decades later. The drift route and artifacts place her in remote Arctic sea beyond interception. Through Albanov and Conrad we see fear, hope, suffering, determination. Through their voice we bear witness to a ship lost to ice, to men lost to Arctic drift, and to the fragile imprint they left on cold seas and frozen shores. Vladimir Rusanov, Hercules, 1912. They left port in summer 1912. The little schooner Hercules slipped from Alexandrovsk na Murman on June 26th, carrying Vladimir Rusanov, his fiancée Juliette Jean, navigator Alexander Kuchin, scientists, engineers, and a small crew. Their declared mission, coal reconnaissance and geological work around Spitsbergen. But from the start, another journey lay hidden on the charts. A daring push eastward, toward the unknown seas beyond Novaya Zemlya. In the map room we place a base map. Scandinavia, the Barentsz Sea, Novaya Zemlya's twin islands, then the blank stretch of the Kara Sea to Siberia's coast. On that map we begin to draw Hercules' known path in bold ink, and then fade into dotted lines where the pages go missing. The first leg was solid. Goerkels reached Spitsbergen in early July. Rusanov and his team spread out across the archipelago, mapping coastline, staking 28 coal claim posts, gathering geological samples and cataloguing flora and fauna. They left behind one group, a geologist, the zoologist and the ship's bosun, who returned via Norway with the reports and specimens. The rest, including Rusanov and Kuchin, remained. By late August, Goerkels departed Spitsbergen, heading east across the Barentsz Sea toward Novaya Zemlya. At Matochkin Shah, the strait dividing the two halves of Novaya Zemlya, Rusanov left a telegram. Program completed, going east. That message reached St. Petersburg and became the last official word from the expedition. From that point, the map's ink fades. After Matochkin Shah, the dotted route picks a path hugging the northern coast of Novaya Zemlya, rounding its northern tip, then turning eastward beyond into the Sea of Ice. The intended route would push past Uyadinania Island, cross the Kara Sea, possibly towards Severnaya Zemlya or further east. But nothing further came through. No logs returned, no rescue ship encountered them, no direct message posthumously delivered. Years passed. In 1934, a cairn on an island in the Mona Islands, later called Hercules Island, bore the inscription Hercules 1913. Carved in wood, a marker of presence. Nearby, explorers found a wooden post in stone mounds, a message left in driftwood. On islets off the Menina Skerries, relics appeared. A hunting knife, cameras, clothing fragments, shells, personal papers of crew member Chukchin, and a watch belonging to V. Popov. A rough shelter of drift logs had been erected against rock. Those items fill in small patches, a name, a tool, a castaway's path. They prove that Goerkels did round Novaya Zemlya, entered the Kara Sea, and pressed further east than any previous record for the vessel, but where exactly and for how long is unclear. The finds suggest that some men may have left the ship and attempted an overland route towards settlements on Siberia's coast. Perhaps Chukchin and Popov moved south when supplies ran low, leaving markers behind. Another alleged find in 1947 claimed bones and a campsite on Bolshevik Island, Severnaya Zemlya. That theory would place the expedition deep into the eastern Arctic, perhaps into the Laptov Sea before succumbing. But that claim remains speculative and unconfirmed by modern researchers. In the map room we see overlapping candidate routes, one path turning southeast toward the Piasna River estuary, another lingering eastward towards Severnaya Zemlya. Dotted lines fan outward, representing alternate theories. The idea that the crew survived into 1913 or beyond gains weight, given the 1934 relics. If men made landfall or tried trekking south, maps may show faint branches reaching islands or coastlines. The missing pages are long and blank. No manifest confirms which men tried overland. No narrative exists of last camps, of final days. Rusanov, Kuchin, Juliette Jean all vanish into that blank region. Historians debate. Did the ship sink in ice? Did survivors reach shore? Did they wander lost? No testimony from locals or later expeditions confirms contact. In recent decades, searches along the Taimyr Peninsula and the Kara coast uncovered further items. In 2000, an expedition claimed human bones near Mount Minin, suspected to belong to Kuchin. But DNA analysis remains inconclusive. 2020 Russian expedition retraced Rusanov's proposed path, surveying islands, placing memorial plaques, recovering artifacts matching clothes or ship hardware. These efforts help narrow where Goerkels might have passed. On the map, artifacts and search logs cluster near the Mona Islands, the Menina Skerries, the Taimyr shore. Those clusters serve as heuristics. The ships collapse, drift, break apart, or survivors' paths likely lay near those places. The map room is haunted by gaps, entire sea expanses where nothing was recovered, no camps found, no human remains preserved. In the absence of a continuous record, scholars use drift models, sea ice data, prevailing wind and current patterns, and known artifacts to constrain possibilities. Some argue that Goerkels was crushed in ice near the Kara Sea east, then sank in deep waters, leaving only floating debris that later reached islands. Others propose survivors made it ashore in Siberia, walked inland, or launched small boats along rivers. But without camps, journals, local memory, or bones in identifiable graves, these paths remain speculative. In the map room we examine Rusanov's bold decision. After fulfilling the coal reconnaissance in Svalbard, he switched mission mid-voyage to attempt Eastern Passage, a decision outside formal orders. The fact that 3 crew left earlier suggests the dangers were clear. The size of Gerkule's 63 tons, 24 GP engine modest supply was marginal for the Kara Sea route. That vessel, though seaworthy in ice-strewn seas, had limited reserve strength for extended drift or heavy pack conditions. Contours of the map show Gerkule's fitting too small for the distances she attempted. The lack of trailing logs may reflect that she drifted into deeper ice fields, beyond shipping lanes. Survivors may have been stranded inland beyond Siberian communities, unable to reach known posts. Time, scavenging and permafrost degrade evidence. Thus, the gap between the last telegram at Matochkin Shah and the relics decades later is vast. Those years, 1912, 1913, 1914, are missing pages. The map room holds only a partial line, broken arcs, short-dashed routes and artifact dots. We cannot trace where Rusanov and his crew ended. The board is full of question marks. Where did their drift stop? Did any walk home? Did the sea swallow them? Yet every recovered object tightens the map's margins. The inscription Hercules 1913 anchors the voyage's reach. Chukchin's watch, Popov's papers, the drift shelter. Each is a small map pin against void. They tell that the journey advanced far into Arctic depths, beyond Novaya Zemlya, into seas few had charted, where ice pressure reigns. In this room we leave behind bold names, dotted routes, unfinished arcs, and the blank sea beyond. The map's edges stretch into cold, silent waters, where Gerkules and her crew vanished into time. Tessum and Knutsen Mail Party, 1919. They made camp on the coast at Cape Chelyuskin, the northern tip of the Taimyr Peninsula. In the late autumn of 1919, with frost already gripping land and sea, Peter Tessum and Paul Knutsen stood beside an ice-shore cabin, the wind howling off the frozen Kara Sea. They were 2 of the crew of Roald Amundson's Maud, left behind to deliver mail and scientific records to the telegraph station at Dixon. Their orders were clear: wait until the sea froze, then sledge southwest along the western Taimyr coast, carrying data that represented years of Arctic work. The last people to see them, their crewmates aboard Maud, waved from her deck as she slid free of ice in September. That was the final signal. On the 12th of September 1919, as Maud pulled away, Tessum and Knutsen remained on the shore, their sledges ready, their hearts firm. They believed the path ahead would be familiar. The coast had been traversed before by expeditions of Sverdrup and others. Still, the route lay over barren sea ice, open leads, shifting floes, and hundreds of kilometres of tundra beyond. They carried mail, data, clothing, provisions, enough for weeks if the seas cooperated, but the Arctic does not play by human calendars. The sea froze, as expected, in October. With winter's onset came darkness and low temperatures. The 2 men began their trek over the ice edge, heading southwest. Their path would follow the coastline, hitting points where driftwood and fuel might be gathered, where caches left by earlier explorers might be found. Their pace must have been slow, cautious. Each step risked broken ice, hidden cracks, leads of open water. Behind them was the cabin, ahead uncertainty. For a time they made progress. In November they passed Miss Vilda. There, in a cairn built by Sverdrup in 1915, they found provisions talked of in earlier expedition logs. They left a note. All is well, January 15th, 1919, Tessum, Knutsen. That tin message, placed in a weatherproof can, gave the first confirmed sign they lived beyond the departure. After that point the signals fade. The map beyond Miss Vilda darkens. Searchers found traces of small campfires near Poluostrov Mikhailova. There, bones, empty cartridges, buttons, broken tools and fragments of gear were strewn near the shore. Some thought these remains indicated one of the men died, that the survivor burned his mate's body when the ground was frozen and unburial impossible. Later expeditions, however, re-examined those remains and suggested some belonged to Vladimir Rusanov's ill-fated Gerkules expedition decades earlier. The overlap in geographic zone muddies attribution. In 1922, the geologist N.N. Urvantsev led a Soviet expedition that discovered the mail and scientific notebooks near the Zeledeyeva River, stored in an abandoned cache. Nearby, at the mouth of the Uboynaya River, pairs of skis and a fragment of a sleeping bag were found. These were supplies abandoned by the missing men. River paths suggested they had reached the mainland coast in that stretch and were travelling inland or along rivers toward Dixon. A skeleton lay on a slope opposite Dixon Island, within sight of the station's lights. The man was dressed, and on his wrist a golden watch engraved with Tessum was recovered. A gold ring bearing the name of his wife was also found. The presumption is strong. This man was Peter Tessum. The cause of his death is debated. Some suggest starvation. Others propose he fell while attempting to reach the station, knocked himself unconscious, and froze to death. But whether he stumbled or collapsed from weakness or both is unknown. The other man, Paul Knutsen, was never found. From signals to silence, from a message in a tin can to empty sky, from skis abandoned to a silent slope, the story of Tessum and Knutsen moves from an Arctic dispatch into mystery. Their last confirmed signal was all is well at Miss Vilda. The trail after that is broken camps, scattered gear, a skeleton in snow. The silence beyond the slope is deeper than any ice. Search expeditions tried to retrace their path. In 1921, a Soviet-Norwegian team led by Nikifor Begichev travelled along the coast. They followed probable routes, inspected cairns, retrieved caches, opened drifted stores, probed campfires, and questioned local recollections. But they could not reconstruct precise paths or recover further remains. The bones by Mikhailova were equivocal. Some gear matched Maud's inventories, some did not. The map room remains marked with silences. Edge lines, dashed routes, question marks. In the map room we see their route prick the coast. From Cape Chelyuskin, along the Taimyr shore, past Miss Vilda, past Mikhailova, toward Dixon. But the lines beyond the Uboynaya are fragmented. The mail archive items and skis show they made it that far. But their steps beyond, toward the station itself, disappear into white space. The slope opposite Dixon, the discovered skeleton, represents perhaps their final act. But we cannot confirm whether that slope lay exactly on their intended onward route, or if they deviated inland to avoid ice, rivers, or obstacles. Thus the story inhabits signal verses. Silence. The confident message in the cairn, the promised mail route, the sight of Maud's retreat, each a signal of intent, of a live hope. Then silence takes over. Missing footsteps, decayed caches, unclaimed trail. The map records the signal beyond is blank space, where ice and time erased the path. Joshua Slocum, 1909. In late autumn 1909, Captain Joshua Slocum slipped anchor aboard his beloved sloop Spray, bound south toward warmer seas. It was meant to be a routine voyage, a winter cruise from Massachusetts toward the Caribbean, perhaps down to South America or the Orinoco. Yet somewhere on that journey Slocum vanished. No wreck, no body, no final log. His fate rests between what we know and what stories imagine. In the archive, Slocum is a well-documented mariner. He was born in Nova Scotia in 1844 and became the first person to sail solo around the world between 1895 and 1898, documenting that epic voyage in sailing alone around the world. His command of small boat seamanship and navigation in remote waters earned him wide respect. During the years after his circumnavigation, he continued to sail Spray along coastal routes, often between North America and the Caribbean. On the 14th of November 1909, Slocum set sail from Vineyard Haven, Massachusetts, aboard Spray. His intended route, southward toward islands of the West Indies and onward to the rivers of South America. That is his last confirmed departure. Shortly before leaving, he resupplied in Miami, possibly about to head toward Florida's Keys or St. Thomas. After that, silence. By mid-1910, his wife and supporters realized no messages were coming. In July 1910, she told newspaper editors she feared he was lost at sea. In the 1920s, he was officially declared dead. Beyond that departure slip, the archive holds little. There is no letter, no radio call, no ship discovery that can be conclusively tied to Spray or Slocum after November 1909. No logbooks, no retrieved charts, no survivors. The Spray itself never turned up. The official record is a disappearance at sea, in an unknown location, date unknown, man lost in the ocean. Into that gap step the myths, rumours and speculation. Some claim Slocum was struck by a steamship in Forbidden Lanes, his small vessel overwhelmed by a great wave or collision. Others suggest he was lost in a hurricane or tropical storm, overwhelmed by conditions beyond what even he could manage. A few whisper of piracy, shipwreck isles, or drift to remote coasts, perhaps in the Caribbean or off South America. One enduring theory holds that his ballast in Spray may have shifted in a knockdown, unbalancing her and causing a capsize. Some supporters note that Spray's ballast was concrete cement, secured to prevent shifting, but argue that extraordinary wave action might have broken that fix and triggered disaster. Another myth runs that Slocum's plans included venturing into the Amazon or Orinoco rivers, perhaps to explore inland waters after reaching the coast. If so, he might have steered Spray toward river mouths, then attempted upriver navigation, winding through tributaries until his craft became lost in currents, silt, or unknown channels. But no reliable record confirms he made that inland turn. Over time, stories gathered in sailing circles. A few captains reported having seen a small sloop matching Spray's description in distant ports, but none with certainty. Some islanders claim to have found marine gear or charts washed ashore in remote Caribbean or South American beaches, though none authenticated to Slocum. For years, enthusiasts searched shipping logs, passenger ship records, and marine correspondence, trying to match a steamer's logbook entry, but nothing definitive emerged. In the myth versus archive balance, the archive is stark and sombre. Slocum sails away, then disappears. The myths are colourful and speculative. Collision, storm, drift to unknown shores, inland rivers. None rise above probability. His own writing and character suggest caution, competence and care, not bold recklessness. He had sailed Spray for decades and knew her behaviour intimately. He understood risks of ballast, steering, seamanship. That reduces the likelihood of gross error but cannot exclude the sudden disaster. One technical note: Spray was considered a remarkably balanced sloop with self-steering qualities and a well-distributed ballast scheme. Her ballast was secured concrete inside her hull, with no external ballast. In tests, replica versions of Spray have proven capable of righting from severe knockdowns, giving weight to arguments that a sudden capsize would require extreme conditions. Some engineers propose that in a rogue wave or storm knockdown, a shifting internal ballast or broken rigging might disrupt that balance, making recovery impossible. But this remains speculative. Another archive point: Spray's hull and rigging had long service. Over decades of refits, wear, repair and aging were inevitable. In November, in potentially rough Atlantic waters, she may have encountered hidden reefs, floating debris or shifting currents she could not avoid. Slocum's plan to sail south in winter would have put him in zones where storms intensify and navigational hazards increase. The void of physical evidence is tragic and deep. All signals cease after November 1909. No wreck survey has produced Spray. No body has turned up washed ashore. No journal reappeared. The silence is unbroken. The myth stories, plausible or not, exist in the blank sea beyond the last signal. In the sea's memory, Spray and her captain drift toward myth. Mariners and historians place dots on maps. Possible storm paths, shipping lanes, drift models estimating where Spray might have gone down. Some model drift from Vineyard Haven toward Caribbean sea currents, plotting where a derelict hull might land or sink. Others consider hurricane paths in the November-December season, comparing data of storms in 1909. Some look toward the Windward Islands, the Greater Antilles, the Orinoco Delta region, but none deliver certitude. Thus, Slocum's disappearance remains suspended between archive and myth. The archive gives one firm signal: his departure and commitment to sail. The myth realm supplies numerous conjectures: collision, rogue wave, storm, shifting ballast, drift, inland river turn. His absence remains a blank region on the map of his life story. The name Joshua Slocum still evokes not just his solo circumnavigation, but the mystery of a sailor who departed and never returned. USS Cyclops, 1918. In the first months of 1918, the USS Cyclops left her port assignments for what should have been a routine supply voyage. She was a US Navy collier, designed to carry coal to ships at sea, and had served faithfully for years. Her hull was long and narrow, her engines slow but steady, and she carried a crew and complement of 309 men and officers. The route planned that winter was simple: from the east coast of the United States to Brazil and back again, part of the Navy's mission to fuel operations in the South Atlantic during wartime. It was a voyage repeated many times before, and there was no reason to suspect this one would be different. Cyclops departed Norfolk, Virginia on January 9, 1918, with a full cargo of coal. She arrived safely in Rio de Janeiro in February, and soon afterward proceeded to the port of Salvador, where she loaded a new cargo, manganese ore heavy and dense essential to steelmaking. When she departed Brazil on February 22nd, she was loaded deep in the water. Witnesses in port remarked that she appeared heavily burdened, almost dangerously so. Her starboard engine was not operating at full strength. One of the cylinders had developed cracks during earlier operations, but repairs were deferred until her return home. Despite the reduced power, her officers believed she could manage the voyage north. On March 3rd, Cyclops made an unscheduled stop at Barbados to take on more coal. The weather was clear and no mechanical problems were reported to the port authorities. Captain George W. Worley told the American consul that all was well. At 5 p.m. on March 4th, the Cyclops left Barbados, bound for Baltimore. That was the last confirmed sighting of the ship. She never reached her destination. No wireless messages were sent, no distress signals received. In the weeks that followed, the Navy waited, first expecting delay, then fearing the worst. When she failed to appear by the end of March, the US Navy launched a search. No wreckage, oil slick, or floating debris was ever found. The ship had vanished without trace, carrying every man aboard into silence. The official inquiry gathered testimony from port officers, naval personnel, and weather observers. There had been no known storms severe enough to destroy a steel ship so suddenly. No enemy submarines were operating along her course, and the German Navy later denied any involvement. Yet, something catastrophic had occurred in a region that by all logic should have offered safety. Over time, the investigators assembled what evidence they could and began weighing possibilities. The first and most plausible theory centered on the ship's load. Manganese ore is far heavier than coal. The holds may have been overfilled, lowering the Cyclops' stability margin. Her design, though solid for coal transport, was not ideal for such density. When waves lifted her bow and stern, the midsection might have been left unsupported, producing a bending strain known to naval architects as hogging or sagging. If that stress reached a critical point, the ship could have broken amidships and sunk within minutes. Such a failure would have left no time for radio transmission or lifeboat launch. The complete absence of debris aligns with such an event. Another possible factor was the cargo itself. If the ore was not tightly packed, motion at sea could cause it to shift. A sudden shift to one side could create a dangerous list. Once tilted, a heavily loaded ship becomes nearly impossible to right, and a roll to leeward in rough water could capsize her. Given the rough but not exceptional conditions common in the Atlantic that season, such a chain of events could have unfolded swiftly and fatally. A smaller but not impossible factor was her mechanical condition. Sailing on one functioning engine, the Cyclops would have been less manoeuvrable, slower to turn, and weaker in maintaining heading through large seas. A breakdown or flooding of her engine room could have made her helpless. If she were caught beam on to heavy waves or a squall line, the forces could have overwhelmed her structure. A damaged propeller shaft, which had been reported months earlier, might have contributed to internal stress. A sudden structural collapse would explain the total absence of wireless distress, as power would have failed instantly. Some suggested she was lost to a storm or rogue wave. The Atlantic is known to produce rare, massive waves that rise without warning and collapse any vessel in their path. Yet the weather logs from Barbados and other nearby stations did not record a hurricane or extraordinary system in her path at that time. Still, even a moderate storm combined with overloading could have been enough to finish her. Wartime speculation introduced darker possibilities. The ship disappeared during World War I when German U-boats hunted Allied commerce. Could she have been torpedoed? The German Naval Archive, examined after the war, recorded no such engagement. No U-boat claimed a ship matching Cyclops' description, and none operated along her projected course. Without floating wreckage, oil or survivor testimony, the theory of enemy action faded but never entirely vanished. Another rumour held that discontent among officers or sabotage led to the disaster. Captain Worley, a naturalised American originally from Germany, had a stern reputation and was said to rule harshly. Some crew members reportedly disliked him, and one US consul's note described discipline aboard as strained. Later writers imagined a mutiny, a scuttling or deliberate sinking, yet the inquiry found no supporting documents, no witnesses, and no motive strong enough to justify such an act. Nothing in the ship's history supports internal violence. As the years passed and no evidence surfaced, the mystery began to drift from inquiry into folklore. The Cyclops' route ran through the western Atlantic, near regions later linked to what popular culture calls the Bermuda Triangle. In newspapers and pulp accounts of the 1950s and 1960s, her name became a symbol of ships swallowed by the sea, joining stories of aircraft and freighters allegedly vanishing without explanation. These myths painted her as a victim of magnetic anomalies, sea monsters, or otherworldly forces. None of those claims rest on documented fact. The disappearance long predates radar and satellite tracking, but within the records of the Navy it remains a maritime tragedy, not a supernatural one. The balance between myth and archive reveals two worlds, one shaped by documents, measurements, and silence, another built of imagination filling the gaps. The archive shows a heavy ship, damaged machinery, a risky load, and a quiet ocean. The myth imagines storms that never came, invisible enemies or sea portals. Between them stands only what is known: a departure from Barbados, a missing arrival, 309 men erased somewhere between. The US Navy eventually issued a formal statement of loss, listing the Cyclops as missing, cause unknown. She remains the single largest non-combat loss in American naval history. The sea that covers her also covers every clue. The inquiry room closes with fragments of evidence laid on its table. The cargo manifest, the last departure log, the letter to families, and the silence that followed. The ship's final entry, the signal sent on March 4th, and the stillness after that day form the thin line between certainty and the vast, unspeaking Atlantic. SS Waratah, 1909. Aboard the SS Waratah, steel rails gleam, cabins gleam, and the hum of engines whispers through passageways. She was a proud ship, built in 1908, intended for both passengers and cargo, designed to carry emigrants outward and freight on return. Her bimetal engines, twin screws, double bottom, watertight compartments, all promise strength and reliability. Yet on her second voyage, somewhere between Durban and Cape Town in July 1909, she vanished without a trace. Waratah left Durban on the 26th of July 1909, carrying 211 people, crew, passengers, cargo. Her outward voyage had been smooth, she had weathered seas and storms earlier. But this leg of the voyage would be different. By dawn on the 27th of July, Waratah was sighted by Clan McIntyre, passing her on the starboard side. The two ships exchanged signal lamp codes, confirming names and destinations. Waratah steamed past at perhaps 13 knots. By mid-morning she'd faded into the horizon. That final sighting is the last confirmed moment, the last point in time when Waratah was known to be afloat. Moments after that, the weather began to change. A storm brewing off the eastern South African coast intensified rapidly. Seas rose, winds gusted. The Agula's current pressed against the ship. The encounter of storm, current, depth changes, and ship behaviour formed the stage for disaster. Consider her design. Waratah was 465 feet long, about 59 feet in beam, with a draft near 30 feet when fully loaded. She featured a steel hull with a double bottom, subdivided into 8 watertight compartments. She carried refrigeration machinery, cold chambers, and could convert cargo holds into dormitories for emigrant service. Her propulsion was by twin quadruple expansion steam engines, driving twin screws with capacity to make around 13.5 knots. On her maiden voyages she had performed well. Yet some passengers and officers reported a tendency to roll. Some said she responded slowly to corrective forces. On her maiden voyage, a fire in a coal bunker had been controlled after several days, a hint of vulnerability. In Durban, a prominent passenger, Claude Sawyer, reputedly stepped off before the final leg, claiming Waratah felt top-heavy and describing unnerving visions. His departure may be coincidental, or a human instinct sensing imbalance. The design stress of a ship built for mixed use, passengers, emigrants, cold cargo, bulk ore, meant stability margins had to cover a wide envelope. If loading was poor, ballast misallocated, or cargo stowed incorrectly, centre of gravity could shift upward relative to metacentric height. The evidence of reports of excessive list in earlier voyages suggests that Waratah might have been pushed perilously near the limit of stability under some conditions. Now turn to weather and environment. The route between Durban and Cape Town lies within stormy sea lanes. Off the wild coast, sudden squalls, tropical depressions and heavy seas are not rare. In 1909, on that day, weather deteriorated sharply after the last sighting. Clan McIntyre's captain later testified it was among the worst storms he'd seen in 13 years at sea. Tremendous waves, violent wind and seas that pinched every hull. Bathymetry matters too. Off Algoa Bay, the continental shelf drops, submarine canyons and abrupt depth changes interact with current and wave trains, possibly amplifying wave heights locally. A modern study reconstructing sea conditions and currents posits that Waratah may have encountered a rogue wave near the continental shelf break. The alignment of stormfront, ocean currents, seabed geometry and ship heading create a scenario in which a wave dramatically taller than the surrounding sea could build, on the order of 20 metres or more, and strike with little warning. If that wave overwhelmed Waratah, she might have rolled far past her righting moment, flooded her holds through open hatches or deck plating, capsized, or broken up rapidly. In such a case, floating debris would be minimal, and lifeboats might never reach the surface. The wreck could sink almost whole, leaving little afloat to mark her grave. Next, human and operational factors. Waratah was not radio-equipped, a significant limitation. Had she been damaged, no distress call could be made beyond visual signals. The crew and passengers had to rely on lookouts, visual distress or signal lamps, all slow. In heavy seas, directing launching of lifeboats is hazardous. In sudden capsize, they might not be deployed at all. The captain and officers would have had seconds, not minutes, to respond. If the ship began to take water in one hold, compensating ballast, counter-flooding or pump action might have been overwhelmed. If the heavy cargo or coal shifted, corrective countermeasures would require rapid action in dangerous seas, a tall order. The combination of heavy cargo, including lead ore, possible list, storm, possible structural stress, and no radio is a dangerous mix. A sudden capsize or catastrophic flooding leaves few survivors and little trace. Sightings and reports after Waratah's disappearance add dramatic roots to the mystery. After the official sighting faded midday the 27th of July, later that day, Harlow, a passing ship, claimed to see a heavily rolling ship in storm, then lights disappearing and flashes, perhaps explosions. The Union Castle liner Guelph similarly claimed to have seen TAH in lamp signals. A local diary entry from Cape-mounted rifleman Edward Joe Conker described observations through a telescope. He saw a steamship struggling with heavy seas, rolling to starboard, and a following wave overwhelming her, after which she vanished. But none of those accounts were definitive enough to pin down her fate or position. An investigative board of trade inquiry in 1910 examined ship logs, builders' plans, passenger and crew testimonies from earlier voyages, and reports of Waratah's behaviour. Some witnesses had felt unstable roll, slow righting behaviour and listing. Others countered that the ship felt solid. Experts from her builder and classification societies defended her design and stability calculations. The inquiry noted contradictory testimony and gaps in loading records, but made no conclusive determination of cause. The absence of survivors or wreckage made it impossible to reach a definitive conclusion. Many theories blossomed in the years after. Some held that Waratah struck a reef or rock near the coast, silently shearing off. Others claimed internal explosion of coal bunker gas or boiler accidents might have ruptured her hull from within. But explosions tend to leave debris or signs. None such were reliably found. Some speculated she capsized in an act of sudden instability under wave, or sank from flooding after storm damage to hull plating or hold leaks. The rogue wave theory now has modern support via oceanographic modelling. In design versus weather versus human reaction, Waratah's disappearance lies at the intersection. The ship may have been pushed past her stability envelope by a freak wave, her internal structure stressed by overloading or list, and with no chance to send signals, she was submerged and erased by sea. The location of wreck, possibly off Algoa Bay's shelf break near Bird Island Canyon, remains unconfirmed. Decades of search, sonar sweeps and expedition efforts yielded no definitive find. The sea took her, and the waves washed away the clues, leaving the design, weather, and human limits to whisper possibilities in an ocean of silence. HMS Atalanta, 1880. A brisk sea wind rattles rigging as HMS Atalanta, a Royal Navy training ship, departs Bermuda on the 31st of January 1880, bound for Falmouth, England. She carries cadets, officers and crew, many of them young and inexperienced. The sky is clear at departure, the harbour is calm, signals flash, sails rise. The ship stands a last wave, then turns to open sea. From that point on, everything after is swallowed by uncertainty. In the early hours after she left Bermuda, other vessels saw her on course, the Atalanta's masts and lights visible against the horizon. That is the signal, the final confirmed point when she was known to be afloat, moving northeast across the Atlantic. The days that followed brought no further word. No message reached England. No distress call bent the airwaves. The Atalanta vanished into silence. The Royal Navy, families and the public awaited news. Ships were dispatched, ports alerted, telegrams sent across the empire. But no wreckage washed ashore in the Azores, the Canary Islands, or along the Atlantic coasts en route to Europe. No survivors were picked from lifeboats, no bodies found on coastlines. The silence deepened. What do records tell us of her design and operating risks? Atalanta was originally launched as HMS Juno in 1844, renamed Mariner in January 1878, then renamed Atalanta 2 weeks later. By 1880 she served as a sail training ship. Reports suggest she had a reputation for being somewhat lightly built, reflecting hull lines favouring speed over heavy stability. In Bermuda, prior crew and shipwrights suggested she had a narrow beam relative to her length, a design feature that can reduce stability in heavy seas. Some former crew claimed they had seen the ship roll heavily in storms, with a list beyond 32 degrees. In one early voyage, cadets reportedly observed she responded slowly to corrective helm input. Others said her sails and rigging, stretched for training purposes, increased top weight. Because training ships often carry extra gear, boats, sails, rigging, stores, the centre of gravity may have been higher than optimal. These design sensitivities could make her vulnerable in sudden sea conditions. Given the Atlantic route from Bermuda, she would pass through regions prone to storms, sudden squalls, and shifting pressure systems, especially in late winter. A powerful storm or hurricane could have developed unseen, veering into her course. If a storm wave struck her beam, broadside, in heavy seas, the momentary force could roll her past her righting moment. If too much water flooded deck hatches, scuppers, or gun ports, recovery would be hard or impossible. The combination of design margins and environmental factors opens a window into human limits. Crew trained for seamanship might not yet have learned how to manage extreme rolls, shifting cargo, or rapid flooding. In the dark of night under storm winds, the ability to correct list or launch pumps is limited. If she heeled dangerously, water would enter openings. If the crew lacked ballast adjustments or pump capacity, the list would worsen. In such a case, the ship might capsize or founder rapidly. Hypotheses later proposed that Atalanta was overwhelmed in violent weather that crossed her path a few weeks after departure. Some contemporary accounts, though unverified, claimed ships observed storm-swollen seas and debris in the water in the likely shipping lanes. The gunboat Avon reportedly passed through the area around the same time and noted quantities of wreckage floating at sea, though nothing clearly identified as Atalanta, but such accounts are anecdotal, inconsistent and unconfirmed by direct evidence. Another speculative factor is the inexperience of many aboard. As a training ship, Atalanta carried cadets with limited experience of heavy weather. If a sudden roll occurred, the crew's response might have been delayed, uncoordinated, or incorrect. Hesitation, delayed counter-helming, or inability to close water inlets quickly could prove fatal. In the signal versus silence structure, Atalanta's departure is the only bright mark. We have her point of leaving Bermuda, sightings on course early, then nothing. Silence fills the days and months that followed. With no survivors, no wreck found, no confirmed debris, the silence dominates. The archive is minimal, Navy logs confirming her departure, reports of her role as training ship, reports of her design reputation and rumours of instability, but no final word. Into that void myths gathered, that she fell victim to the so-called Bermuda Triangle, that she encountered some supernatural force. But these belong not in the archive but in the realm of speculation. The tragedy of HMS Atalanta lies in the moment she last raised her sails and the emptiness that followed, a signal cut off by silence, leaving only questions about design, weather, and human frailty on open sea. SS President, 1841. A muted dawn on the 11th of March 1841 found SS President, then the largest steamer afloat, slipping out of New York Harbour bound for Liverpool. She was carrying around 136 souls, passengers, crew, officers, all expecting a routine Atlantic crossing. The ship itself was ambitious. 3 decks, ornate cabins, twin paddle wheels, and a reputation for luxury. But beneath its promise she bore design compromises, mechanical limitations, and the weight of human expectations. By the next morning, 12 March, President was sighted by the packet ship Orpheus amid heavy seas off George Bank, near the dangerous shoals between Nantucket and the edge of the Atlantic continental shelf. Captain Cole of Orpheus reported that President appeared labouring tremendously in gale conditions. She pitched deeply, rolled broadly, and strains of the storm seemed to press against her hull. That is the last confirmed sighting, her signal into the storm before silence overtook her. From that moment, the timeline of President's final hours enters dark waters. Late on the 12th of March, the gale intensified. Seas grew to monstrous proportions. President was not seen again. No distress signal reached nearby liners. No lifeboats were reported, no bodies washed ashore in the months that followed. Her destination never received her. Several days later, scattered bits of wreckage were found and reported, though none could be conclusively tied to her. Burnt fragments off Cape Hatteras, a life jacket or plank sighted in the Atlantic, a drifted piece of hull possibly seen years later in mid-Atlantic waters. Because these finds were disconnected and unverified, they remain whispers rather than proof. The ship's previous performance offers clues about what she faced. President's designers had pushed to make her larger than any contemporary paddle steamer. She carried a 3rd deck atop a hull roughly the same waterline dimensions as her predecessor, British Queen. That extra deck gave her more passenger space, but also raised her centre of gravity, making her more prone to rolling. She was already known to roll excessively in storms. Her engines were underpowered relative to her size. After her 2nd voyage, modifications were made to her paddle wheels to avoid patent infringement, replacing feathering paddles with basic ones. That cost her efficiency, especially in heavy seas. She lost the ability to push strongly against wind and wave. Reports from her short service noted slow passages compared to her rivals. To compensate, the owners sometimes overloaded her with cargo. On her final voyage, she reportedly carried extra coal or freight to bolster revenue. That load would have sat deep in the ship, further reducing freeboard and making her sluggish in responding to waves. In rough seas, a low freeboard means that waves can more easily wash onto decks, inundate openings, and stress the hull. As President battled the Atlantic gale on the 12th of March, the combination of heavy roll tendency, overloading, and inadequate propulsion would have made her vulnerable. Each wave that struck her side would lever her beam, pushing her list more, exposing vulnerable scuppers, portholes, or deck hatches. If a wave forced open a weak hatch or scupper, flooding would begin internally. In heavy seas, flooding accelerates list and trim, making the ship harder to correct. In the dark under gale, sudden capsize or foundering might come without warning, with no time to recover or signal. Captain Cole's observation from Orpheus is chilling. He believed President could not survive much longer after their last sighting. He estimated that within 24 hours she would founder or sink under the storm's wrath. If she did break apart or founder in that night of raging waves, survivors would have had scant chance. Lifeboats in heavy seas tend to overturn. The men would have been thrown into freezing water. Without rescue ships nearby, they would perish swiftly. The days that followed saw the British and American steam navigation companies scrambling for information. Newspapers ran headlines, inquiries were launched, and families waited in anguish. Even Queen Victoria followed the case. News dispatches were urged to keep her abreast. The ship's owner, already financially fragile, collapsed amid the publicity and uncertainty. Because no body, log, or cabin record ever reached England, historians pieced the narrative from her last sighting, her design history, wreckage rumours, and storm data. The Liverpool University's archive and maritime scholars later collated what was known: her last point, tilde 39°46 N 71°W, the duration of the storm, the ocean currents, and her known vulnerabilities. In tracing her final timetable, departure the 11th of March, sighting the 12th of March in gale, disappearance later 12 or the 13th of March, debris found only ambiguously later, no survivors ever found. That timeline becomes the scaffold for reconstruction. Some researchers simulate drift of pieces from the sighting point under Atlantic currents and waves, testing where fragments might have gone. Their models find that debris could drift southward to mid-Atlantic or toward the Azores, but none were ever reliably matched to present. Other reconstructions compare wind and wave climatology for those dates. The 12th of March gale was severe enough to produce waves exceeding her design tolerance. Alternate theories include structural failure. She might have broken in two under bending stress, then one part sank swiftly and the other drifted. Or she might have been overwhelmed by flooding through lost hatches. A third theory even suggests fire in a coal bunker, but no record supports that. Because she was a paddle steamer with wood, iron hull and coal space, a bunker fire is plausible, but it would likely have produced debris and survivors, which did not occur. None of these theories can be confirmed. Thus the timeline lives in two parts: known signal, her sighting by Orpheus in storm off Georges Bank, and then silence. All post-12 March events lie in speculation and model. The Atlantic swallowed the president and its people, leaving only questions in its depths. Clipper Madagascar, 1853. The Madagascar left Melbourne on the 12th of August 1853, her hull heavy with cargo and her decks crowded with passengers eager for the long voyage home. The docks were full of noise and rumour that morning. Gold escorts had arrived from the diggings inland, and men in uniform had guarded wooden boxes marked for shipment to England. 2 tons of gold were said to be aboard, along with wool, rice and other freight bound for London. Before sailing, police came aboard and arrested a group of suspected bushrangers attempting to book passage. 14 of the original crew had already deserted to the goldfields, and the captain had struggled to find replacements. The ship finally cleared the heads late that day and vanished into the open sea. She was never seen again. The Madagascar was a Blackwall frigate built in 1837, part of a proud generation of British merchant ships that combined cargo space with passenger comfort. She had made several voyages between London, Calcutta and Melbourne before this final run. Her owners, the Willis Line, considered her reliable and capable of handling the long route around the Cape of Good Hope. She carried emigrants returning home, merchants, families, sailors, and a small detachment of guards. After her departure, there were no further reports, no distress signals, no messages in bottles, no sightings by passing ships. Months later, when winter storms rolled through the southern Indian Ocean, maritime offices in Melbourne and London began to exchange telegrams. By early 1854, she was presumed lost with all aboard. In the inquiry rooms of maritime registries, officials gathered the few surviving details. The ship had been undermanned when she left port. Replacement sailors were inexperienced and likely unfamiliar with the vessel. The load of gold, dense and packed low in her hold, made her heavy in the water. If overladen, her ability to recover from rolling would be reduced. Witnesses from the dock said she sat deeper in the bay than usual, her waterline lower than expected. These are the fragments of fact from which every later theory has been built. The simplest explanation is that Madagascar met a storm. The route between Australia and the Cape is notorious for heavy seas, strong westerlies, and the violent swells of the Southern Ocean. A sailing ship caught in those conditions could be rolled, dismasted, or flooded within hours. A reduced crew might not have been able to reef sails fast enough or man the pumps. If water entered through hatches or gun ports and the pumps failed, the ship could founder quickly. A sudden capsize would leave no time to lower boats or signal for help. The ocean would close over everything before daylight. Another possibility rests on her condition. Madagascar had already been at sea for more than 15 years. Wood fatigues under constant stress, iron fittings corrode, caulking loosens. If any structural weakness had developed in her hull, a severe storm could have opened her seams. A ship built in the 1830s and heavily laden with gold and cargo was operating near her limits. A break in the keel or a structural split would send her down in minutes. Then there were the stories that began to circulate in Melbourne weeks after her disappearance. People remembered the police arrests before departure. Some claimed that one or more of the bushrangers had accomplices who remained aboard. The rumour said they mutinied at sea, killed the officers, and scuttled the ship after stealing the gold. Others added that they forced the crew to sail toward Madagascar, the island whose name the ship bore, and buried the treasure there. Newspapers printed these tales eagerly, but none were based on evidence. No stolen gold ever appeared, no confessions surfaced, no trace of a ship's cargo was ever recovered. The mutiny theory fed public imagination but could not be proved. Another idea emerged decades later, that the ship burned. Fires were common in wool cargoes, which can self-ignite when tightly packed and damp. If the cargo smouldered unseen, the first sign would be smoke rising through the decks. A fire in mid-ocean could not be controlled for long. Once flames reached rigging and spars, the crew would abandon ship. Yet even in fire, wreckage is usually found. Charred beams and floating timbers would have appeared along southern trade routes. No such debris was logged in the months after she vanished. A handful of sailors claimed in later years to have seen wreckage or remains that might have belonged to the Madagascar. One said that near the Cape of Good Hope his ship passed a floating mast marked with her initials. Another swore to seeing timbers bearing her paint near Mauritius. None of these accounts could be verified, and none matched each other. Maritime records contain hundreds of similar claims linked to lost ships, most born of confusion, distance, or imagination. The truth remains that nothing certain was ever found. The inquiry records show long silences between letters, delayed reports from distant ports, and newspaper clippings glued into ledgers. In them, officials discussed her probable course. The standard route from Melbourne to London passed south of Tasmania, across the Roaring Forties, rounding the Cape of Good Hope and then north through the Atlantic. Ships on similar schedules arrived safely, reporting gales but survivable seas. The Madagascar may have strayed farther south into colder waters to gain stronger winds, where icebergs and low temperatures increased danger. If she struck floating ice or wreckage, she could have been holed below the waterline and gone down unseen. Every theory faces the same obstacle: the complete absence of debris or survivors. The Southern Ocean swallows evidence. Currents move fast and spread wreckage thin. A wooden ship broken up in those latitudes can disappear within hours. Sharks, cold and distance leave no human trace. In an era before wireless, even nearby vessels could not be summoned for help. If the Madagascar sank in storm or broke apart under stress, there would be no way for the world to know until months of waiting turned hope into silence. The gold aboard gave the story a peculiar power. For decades, treasure hunters, writers and adventurers have searched coastlines from South Africa to Madagascar itself, believing the cargo must have been stolen or hidden. None have found a single bar or coin tied to the ship. The manifests of the Melbourne Mint list the shipment precisely, yet its fate is identical to that of the passengers and crew, gone without a sign. In the quiet of the inquiry rooms, with the ledgers closed and the lanterns dimming, the investigators were left with little more than absence. The captain's name, the ship's description, the date of departure, and then a blank space. The Madagascar joined the long register of vessels marked simply as missing. The evidence points to a natural disaster, but the ocean keeps its secrets. Between the police arrests on the pier and the final fading of her sails beyond the horizon, every moment of her end remains unwritten. SS Pacific, 1875. The SS Pacific embarked on her final voyage on the 4th of November 1875, leaving Victoria, British Columbia for San Francisco under a darkening sky. She carried passengers, crew, a heavy cargo, and a stash of gold. Among those aboard were miners heading south with their hopes and savings, emigrants, families and crew accustomed to Pacific crossings. The ship's decks echoed with luggage, crates, chatter and anticipation. All eyes were turned toward the sea ahead. In those early hours, the voyage seemed routine. The Pacific steamed westward through Juan de Fuca Strait, rounding Tatoosh Island in the afternoon. Her captain, Jefferson Davis Howell, was confident she could manage the evening run down the coast. The conditions were not calm. Wind was against her, she listed slightly, but nothing immediately alarming. That is her last widely confirmed point. Passing Tatoosh in moderate form, keeping course. Night fell, visibility dropped, the sea grew restless. The Pacific's list grew more severe. Crew and passengers felt the ship labouring. The clipper Orpheus, sailing opposite direction, encountered her off Cape Flattery. At about 10 p.m, Orpheus's crew saw lights and then collision. The bow of Pacific scraped along Orpheus's starboard side. Orpheus's captain ordered checks, slowed, and attempted repair, not certain the other vessel was seriously damaged. But Pacific, sheared, kept moving southward, unseen in the dark. That collision is perhaps her last contact with another vessel in the night. Immediately after, confusion unfolded aboard Pacific. Reports from the two survivors, the quartermaster Neil Henley and passenger Henry Jelly describe a rapid list to port panic, chaotic launching of lifeboats, flooding, and eventual fracture of the hull. Jelly recalls hearing cries in the water, seeing pieces of the ship drift, lifeboats capsizing, and being washed into survivors' debris fields. Within an hour, the ship broke in two and sank. The stern went down first, pulling the rest under. The two survivors clung to wreckage before rescue. That testimony forms much of the archival core. In the inquiry room, experts weigh evidence: collision, load, list, ship design, human action. The Pacific had known stability issues. She often required trimming. On board, crew had loaded lifeboats partially with water before departure to correct listing. That gesture indicates a tendency to heal unpredictably. On this final voyage, the list worsened under wind and waves, making a recovery difficult. Her cargo was heavy and diverse: coal, hides, grain, over 300 tons of goods, and gold valued at tens of thousands of dollars. The weight of gold, dense and concentrated, may have affected the ship's centre of gravity, reducing her margin for roll. If water entered a hold, correcting list would demand rapid counterflooding or ballast shifts, complex tasks in darkness and flooding conditions. The collision theory is strong. Orpheus's bow scraped Pacific, likely damaging her hull plating or opening seams. Less than 15 minutes after collision, Orpheus assessed no serious damage. Pacific, continuing southward, probably was fatally impaired. That damage, combined with her instability, could have caused rapid flooding that overwhelmed her pump systems. The two survivors' accounts help anchor this theory. Jelly fired flares, but the list made boat launching impossible in many cases. Some lifeboats swung dangerously, others were lost to waves. The sudden list suggests flooding developed quickly. The hull fracture, observed by Jelly and Henley, supports structural failure as she sank. The 2022 discovery of what is believed to be Pacific's wreck by Rockfish Inc. adds a new layer to the inquiry. Court documents show the steamer lies off the Washington coast, some 80 miles south of Cape Flattery, at great depth. Side-scan sonar images show deck machinery, paddle components, and steam engine parts consistent with Pacific's layout. Coal fragments found by trawl fishermen matched coal from the ship's original bunkers, and analysis linked them chemically to Pacific's coal. That evidence, though strong, has not been unequivocally accepted by all maritime authorities. The wreck is still believed to be Pacific. The identification leans heavily on matching artifacts, positioning relative to Cape Flattery, and historical route reconstruction. So the inquiry room now holds old testimonies and new sonar data. The theory of collision followed by rapid flooding aligns both witness statements and wreck location. The ship's known list, vulnerabilities, overloaded cargo, and damage at point of collision form a coherent narrative. Alternative theories, mutiny, sabotage, fire, lack substantial support. No known record suggests foul play occurred. The rapidness of sinking leaves little room for human delay. Between archive and myth, the Pacific story lies in collision, instability, and sea's merciless depth. Rockfish's identification may one day transform theory into near certainty. But until then, the vessel rests in quiet beneath cold waters, her ghost carried by documents and sonar echoes. SS Yongala, 1911. A silver steamer, sleek and proud, slips away into the tropic dusk. In mid-March 1911, the SS Yongala, one of Australia's most luxurious coastal steamers, embarked from Mackay toward Townsville, hugging the Queensland coast. She carries 29 first-class passengers, 19 second-class, and 72 crew, along with cargo, livestock, including the racehorse Moonshine, and goods destined north. It is her 99th voyage, her hull freshly inspected, deemed in excellent trim. The sun dips low and flags flap in warm breeze. Among them, a warning flag flies. A tropical cyclone is raging somewhere between Townsville and Mackay, broadcast by Flattop Island signal station. But the Yongala sails on, perhaps unaware, perhaps bound by schedule. At 1:40 p.m. she leaves Mackay. Passengers wave ashore. The flat skyline of Queensland recedes. On the radio wires, the cyclone warning flashes, but the Yongala's wireless set has not yet been installed. She proceeds north. 5 hours after she departs, the keeper at Dent Island Lighthouse sees her enter Whitsunday Passage, passing between islands en route. That is the last confirmed sighting. She bears steadily into waters already roiled by tropical force, heading straight into danger. Night comes with sudden fury. The cyclone intensifies with wind, rain, and waves building. No wireless call, no flare, no distress signal passes the sea. Below decks, passengers speak in uneasy whispers. The vessel heels under gusts, rain lashes hatches and the cargo deck strain. The Horse Moonshine is later found washed ashore, battered, but that is the only human or large trace found. By early next morning, ships en route begin to report wreckage in the surf. Timber, crates, debris, bits of leather, and small personal effects along the stretch between Hinchinbrook Island and Bowen. The sea casts up fragments, but no lifeboats, no bodies. Coast parties find wreckage drifted ashore. They raise the alarm. Day by day, search vessels line the Queensland coast. But no trace of passengers or crew surfaces. The sea remains mostly blind and unforgiving. Days later, the Marine Board of Queensland convenes its inquiry, 20th of June 1911. With no survivors to question, testimonies focus on Yongala's design. Captain William Knight's experience, the stability record of the ship and the cyclone's known ferocity. The board reviews sea trials, maintenance logs, historical voyages and heavy weather. They conclude the ship was in good condition, the captain competent, and so the fate of the Yongala passes beyond human ken. The loss is declared an unfathomable mystery. In the years that follow, rumours swirl. Perhaps she grounded on reef between Flinders Passage and Keeper Reef. Perhaps she struck a rock near Cape Upstart. Others suggest that waves overwhelmed her from the side, broaching her broadside in a sudden gust. But no wreck site is confirmed. None was located in the early decades. The sea holds its silence. In 1943, a Royal Australian Navy minesweeper fouls itself a few miles east of Cape Bowling Green, marking what looks like a submerged feature. In 1947, HMS Lachlan surveys that area by echo sounding and identifies a suspicious shoal in about 6 fathoms, 300 feet long, surrounded by deeper cuts. Some believe this point corresponds to Yongala. Divers, local enthusiasts and maritime sleuths examine charts, but nothing conclusive emerges until 1958, when Bill Kirkpatrick, a Townsville diver, locates the wreck. She lies at roughly 30 metres deep, about 48 nautical miles southeast of Townsville off Cape Bowling Green. The hull lies intact, listing 60 to 70 degrees to starboard, over sandy bottom. In the wreck, divers recover a steel safe from one of the cabins. Its serial number, 9825W, matches a safe ordered in 1903 for Yongala's purser's office, a critical piece of evidence confirming identity. Today the wreck lies protected under Australian heritage law within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. Its superstructure remains remarkably preserved for over a century underwater. It is a major dive site, teeming with marine life, but always under watch and with no interference allowed. Thus begins the timeline of Yongala, her departure from Mackay, her last sighting entering Whitsunday Passage, her unknown passage into the heart of a cyclone, the fragmentary debris strewn along the Queensland coast in the aftermath, and finally the rediscovery of her resting place in 1958. Between sighting and rediscovery stretches half a century of mystery, speculation, loss, and eventual confirmation beneath the waves. The ocean keeps its secrets. Wrecks rest in darkness, their voices gone, their roots erased. Each disappearance leaves only fragments, dates, sightings, and questions that time cannot close. What began as voyages of hope end as echoes beneath the waves, reminders of how small every ship is against the endless sea.